Excerpts from the Grundrisse. Okay, so to explain what this is, in the Marx-Engels reader, it has several excerpts from the Grundrisse that I assume the author feels are not redundant in Capital and might elucidate things, and they did explain some things for me. And so I'm going to be reading just the excerpts from the Grundrisse from the Marx-Engels reader, 2nd edition. Comprising 7 notebooks written in 1857 to 58, this preparatory effort by Marx to put together the results of his economic studies was first published by the Institute of Marx-Engels Lenin in Moscow in 1939 to 41 as Foundations Grundrisse of the Critique of Political Economy. In recent years, it has attracted growing attention because in the intrinsic interest of various parts, because it forms an important link between the early writings and Capital, and because the very rawness of much of the text enhances its value as a revelation of Marx's creative mental process. The great bulk of it consists of an introduction, a chapter on money, a chapter on capital. This introduction, which appears here in full, and several selections from the chapter on capital, have been chosen partly for what they add to the study of capital. The reader not yet familiar with the basic argument of capital may therefore prefer to turn first to that work below and then return to Grundrisse. Yeah, in this book he put this before capital. Like, you would not understand this before reading capital. He doesn't explain in the terminology here. This is his notes, so like he doesn't explain what any of these things mean. In capital he will, walk you through the terminology the first time. So yeah, I don't know why this is first. Definitely do not read this before Capital. The introduction, besides stating Marx's view on the method of political economy, develops his thesis on production as the basic category. This shows in the final paragraph of the 3rd section that the work on which he was embarked and which later came to fruition in Capital was no more than one part of a more ambitious total project, and concludes with the discussion of the timeless character of the great art. Section B defines society, Section C deals with capitalism as an incessant drive for surplus value and alludes to the future communism as a society in which labor appears no longer as labor, but as the full development of activity itself. Section D supplements Capital on primitive accumulation. Section E deals with the pre-capitalist economies and the birth of capitalism. Section F summarizes Marx's view on population and Malthus. Section G contains a now famous discussion of an ever-increasing automation under capitalism. Section H envisages capitalism's ultimate violent overthrow. Section I contrasts the alienation of labor under capitalism with the postulated ending of alienation in the future. And there in other passages of Grundrisse, Marx here and there uses the alienation terminology, which had been pervasive in the 1844 manuscript, but would grow inconspicuous in Capital. And by the way, he still talks about he is still talking about alienation in Capital. He uses the word less, so don't worry about that. The translation and the footnotes are by Martin Nicholas. The capitalized letters and section headings follow the introduction have been added by the editor of this reader. Section A. Introduction. 1. Production. Independent individuals, 18th century ideas. The object before us, to begin with, material production. Individuals producing in society, hence socially determined individual production, is of course the point of departure. The individual and isolated hunter and fisherman, with whom Smith and Ricardo begin, belongs among the unimaginative conceits of the 18th century Robinsonites, which in no way express merely a reaction against over-sophistication and a return to a misunderstood natural life as cultural historians imagine. As little as Rousseau's contrat social, which brings natural independent autonomous subjects in the relation in connection by contract, rests on such naturalism. This is the semblance, the merely aesthetic semblance of the Robinsonites, great and small. It is rather the anticipation of civil society, in preparation since the 16th century and making giant strides towards maturity in the 18th. In this society, a free competition, the individual appears detached from the natural bonds, which in earlier historical periods makes him the accessory of a definite and limited human conglomerate. Smith and Ricardo still stand with both feet on the shoulders of the 18th century prophets, in whose imaginations this 18th century individual, the product of one side of the dissolution of the federal forms of society, on the other of the new forces of production developed since the 16th century, appears as an ideal, whose existence they project into the past. Not as a historic result, but as a history's point of departure. As the natural individual appropriate to their notion of human nature, not arising historically, but posited by nature. This illusion has been common to each new epoch to this day. Stuart avoids this simple-mindedness because, as an aristocrat, and in the antithesis to the 18th century, he had in some respects a more historical footings. The more deeply we go back into history, the more does the individual, and hence also the producing individual, appear as dependent, as belonging to a greater whole, in a still quite natural way, in the family, and then the family expanded into the clan, then later into the various forms of communal society arising out of the antithesis and fusion of the clans. Only in the 18th century, in civil society, do the various forms of social connectedness confront the individual as a mere means towards his private purposes. As external necessity, but the epoch which produces this standpoint, that of the isolated individual, is also precisely that of the hitherto most developed social form. From this standpoint, general relations, the human being is in the most literal sense, not merely a gregarious animal, but an animal which can individuate itself in the midst of society. Production by an isolated individual outside society, a rare exception which may well occur when a civilized person, in whom the social forces are already dynamically present, is cast by accident into the wilderness, is as much an absurdity as is the development of language without individuals living together and talking to each other. There is no point in dwelling on this any longer. The point could go entirely unmentioned if this twaddle, which has had sense and reason for the 18th century characters, had not been earnestly pulled back into the center of the most modern economics by Bastiat, Carey, Proudhon, etc. Of course, it is a convenience for Proudhon et al. To be able to give a historico-philosophic account of the source of an economic relation, of whose historic origins he is ignorant. By inventing the myth that Adam or Prometheus stumbled on the idea ready-made and it was developed, nothing is more dry and boring than the fantasies of a locus communis. Locus communis means of a commonplace, which means of a commonplace mind. Eternalization of historic relations of production and distribution, property. Whenever we speak of production, then, what is meant is always a production at a definite stage of social development. Production by social individuals. It might seem, therefore, that in order to talk about production at all, we must either pursue the process of historic development through its definite phase, or declare beforehand that we are dealing with a specific historical epoch, such as modern bourgeois production, which is indeed our particular theme. However, all epochs of production have certain common characteristics. Production in general is an abstraction, but a rational abstraction insofar as it really brings out and fixes the common element and thus saves us repetition. Still, this general category, this common element sifted out by comparison, is itself segmented many times over and splits into different determinations. Some determinations belong to all epochs, others only to a few. Some determinations will be shared by the most modern epoch and have the most ancient. No production will be thinkable without them. However, even though the most developed languages have laws and characteristics in common with the least developed, nevertheless, just as those things which determine their development, i.e. the elements which are not general and common, must be separated out from determinations valid for production as such, so that in their unity, which arises already from the identity of the subject, humanity, and the object, nature, their essential difference is not forgotten. The whole profundity of those modern economists who demonstrate the eternity and harmoniousness of the existing social relations lies in this forgetting. For example, no production is possible without an instrument of production, even if this instrument is only the hand. No production without stored up past labor, even if it is the only facility gathered together and concentrated in the hands of the savage by the repeated practice. Capital is, among other things, also an instrument of production. also objectified past labor. That's an important line. Therefore, capital is a general, eternal relation of nature. That is, if I leave out just a specific quality, which alone makes instrument of production and stored up labor into capital, the entire history of production relations thus appears to carry, for example, as a malicious forgery perpetrated by governments. If there's no production in general, then there's also no general production. Production is always a particular branch of production, e.g. agriculture, cattle raising, manufactures, etc., or it is a totality, but political economy is not technology. The relation of the general characteristic of production at a given stage of social development to the particular forms of production to be developed elsewhere later. Lastly, production is also not a particular production. Rather, it is always a certain social body, a social subject, which is active in a greater or sparser totality of branches of production. Nor does the relationship between scientific presentation and real movement belong here yet. Production in general. Particular branches of production, totality of production. It is a fashion to preface a work of economics with a general part, and precisely this part figures under the title production, treating of the general production preconditions of all production. This general part consists, or is alleged to consist, of the conditions without which production is not possible. In fact, to indicate nothing more than the essential moments of all production. But as we will see, this reduces itself, in fact, to a few very simple characteristics, which are hammered out into flat tautologies. 2. The conditions which promote in production to a greater or lesser degree, such as Adam Smith's progressive and stagnant state of society. While this is of value in his work as an insight into elevated to scientific significance, would require investigations into the periodization of degrees of productivity in the development of individual peoples, an investigation which lies outside the proper boundaries of the theme, but insofar as it does belong there, must be brought in as part of the development of competition, accumulation, etc. In the usual formulation, the answer amounts to the general statement that an industrial people reaches the peak of its production at the moment when it arrives at its historical peak generally. In fact, the industrial peak of a people when its main concern is not yet gain, but rather to gain. Thus, the Yankees over the English, or also the e.g. certain races, locations, climates, natural conditions such as harbors, soil fertility, are more advantageous to production than others. There's too amounts to the tautology that wealth is more easily created where its elements are subjectively and objectively present to a greater degree. But none of all this is the economist's real concern in this general part. The aim is rather to present production as distinct from distribution, as encased in eternal natural laws, independent of history, at which opportunity, bourgeois relations are then quietly smuggled in as the inviolable natural laws on which society in the abstract is founded. That's very important. Let me highlight that. This is more or less conscious purpose of the whole proceeding. In distribution, by contrast, humanity has allegedly permitted itself to be considerably more arbitrary. Quite apart from this crude tearing apart of production and distribution, and of their real relationship, it must be apparent from the outset, no matter how differently distribution may have been arranged in different stages of social development, it must be possible here also, just as with production, to sing out common characteristics. It's just as possible to confound or to extinguish all historic differences under general human laws. For example, the slave, the serf, and the wage laborer all receive a quantity of food which makes it possible for them to exist as slaves, as serfs, as wage laborers. The conqueror, who lives from tribute, or the official who lives from taxes, or the landed proprietor in his rent, or the monk in his alms, or the levite in his tithe, all receive a quota of social production, which is determined by other laws than that of the slaves. The two main points which all economists cite under this rubric are 1. Property, 2. Its protection by courts, police, etc. To this, a very short answer might be given. To 1. All production is appropriation of nature, and the part of an individual within and through a specific form of society. In this sense, it is tautology to say property is a precondition of production, but it is altogether ridiculous to leap from that to specific form of property. which further and equally presupposes an antithetical form of non-property. History rather shows common property to be the more original form, a form which long continues to play a significant role in the shape of communal property. The question of whether wherever wealth develops better in this or another form of property is still quite besides the point here. But there can be no production and hence no society when some form of property does not exist is a tautology. An appropriation which does not make something into property is a contradiction in subjecto. To 2, protection, acquisition, etc. When these trivialities are reduced to their real content, they tell more than their preachers know. Namely, that every form of production creates its own legal relations, forms of government, etc., and bringing things which are organically related to an accidental relation into a merely reflective connection, they display their crudity and lack of conceptual understanding. All the bourgeois economists are aware of is that the production can be carried on better under the modern police than on the principle of might makes right. They forget only that this principle is also a legal relation, and that the right of the stronger prevails in their constitutional republics as well as in another form. When the social conditions corresponding to a specific stage of production are only just arising or when they are already dying out, they are naturally disturbances in production, although to different degrees and to which different ethics. To summarize, there are characteristics which all stages of production have in common and which are established as general ones by the mind, but the so-called general preconditions of all production are nothing more than the abstract moments with which no real historical stage of production can be grasped. 2. The general relation of production to distribution, exchange, and consumption. Before going further in the analysis of production, it is necessary to focus on the various categories with which economists line up next to it. The obvious trite notion: in production, the members of society appropriate, create the products of nature in accord with human needs. Distribution determines the proportion in which the individual shares in the product. Exchange delivers the particular products into which the individuals desire to convert, the portion which distribution has assigned to him. And finally, in consumption, the products become the objects of gratification of individual appropriation. Production creates the objects which correspond to the given needs. Distribution divides them up according to social laws. Exchange further parcels out the already divided shares in accord with individual needs. And finally, in consumption, the product steps outside the social movement and becomes a direct object and servant of individual needs and satisfies it in being consumed. Thus, production appears as the point of departure, consumption as conclusion, distribution and exchange as the middle, which is however itself twofold, since distribution is determined by society and exchange by individuals. The person objectifies himself in production, and thing subjectifies itself in the person. In distribution, society mediates between production and consumption in the form of general dominant determinants. In exchange, the two are mediated by the chance characteristics of the individual. Distribution determines the relation in which production falls to individuals, the amount. Exchange determines the production in which individuals demands the portion allotted to him by distribution. Thus, production, distribution, exchange, and consumption form a regular syllogism. Production is generality, distribution and exchange the particularity, the consumption the singularity in which the whole is joined together. This is admittedly a coherent, but shallow one. Production is determined by general natural laws, distribution by social accident, and the latter may therefore promote production to a greater or lesser extent. Exchange stands between the two as a formal social movement and concludes in the concluding act, consumption, which is conceived not only as a terminal point, but also in itself, actually belongs outside economic except insofar as it reacts in turn upon the point of departure and initiates the whole process anew. The opponents of the political economists, whether inside or outside its realm, who accuse them of barbarically tearing apart things which belong together, stand either on the same ground as they or beneath them. Nothing is more common than the reproachment that the political economists view production too much as an end in itself, that distribution is just as important. This accusation is based precisely on the economic notion that the spheres of distribution and of production are independent, autonomous neighbors, or that these movements were not grasped in their unity, as if this rupture had made its way not from the reality into the textbook, but rather from the textbook into the reality, as if the task were the dialectical balancing of concepts, and the grasping of relations. Consumption and production. Production is also immediately consumption. Highlighting something. Twofold consumption, subjective and objective. The individual not only develops his abilities in production, but also expands them, uses them up in the act of production, just as natural procreation is a consumption of life forces. Secondly, consumption of the means of production, which become worn out through use and are partly, e.g. in combustion, dissolved into their elements again. Likewise, consumption of the raw material, which loses its natural form and composition by being used up. The act of production is therefore, in all its moments, also an act of consumption. But the economists admit this. Production as directly identical with consumption, and consumption as directly coincident with production, is termed by them productive consumption. This identity of production and consumption amounts to Spinoza's thesis of determination is negation, i.e., given the undifferentiated self-identity in the universal world, substance, to attempt to introduce particular determinations, is to negate this self-identity. But this definition of productive consumption is advanced only for the purpose of separating consumption as identical with production from consumption proper, which is conceived rather as the destructive antithesis to production. Let us therefore examine consumption proper. Consumption is also immediately production. Just as in nature, the consumption of the elements of chemical substances is the production of the plant. It is clear that in taking in food, for example, which is a form of consumption, the human being produces his own body. But this is also true of every kind of consumption, which in one way or another produces human beings in some particular aspect. Consumptive production. But, says the economist, this production, which is identical with consumption, is secondary. It is derived from the destruction of prior product. In the former, the producer objectified himself. In the latter, the object he created personifies itself. Hence, this consumptive product, even though it is an immediate unity of production and consumption, is essentially different from production proper, the immediate unity in which production coincides with consumption and consumption with production leaves their immediate duality intact. Production, then, is also immediately consumption. Consumption is also immediately production. Each is immediately its opposite, but at the same time, a mediating movement takes place between the two. Production mediates consumption. It creates the latter's material. Without it, consumption would lack an object. But if this is confusing, it's actually pretty simple. It's just... Okay, so basically, when you were producing goods, okay, like, generally, how production for the market for exchange is done in a commodity society, okay, it involves the consumption of labor. Okay, that's something that's produced. It needs to be consumed. Okay. Additionally, you produce goods, they have to be consumed. Like, for them to have their market, they have to be, well, at least bought in, for the purpose of consumption. For their market value to be validated. That's the whole point. Okay, so, yeah, that's what he's talking about. That's what he's saying, very simplified. But consumption also mediates production, in that it alone creates for the latter's material. Without it, consumption will lack an object. But consumption... The products are the subject for whom they are products. The product only attains its last finish in consumption. A railway on which that known trains run, hence which is not used up, not consumed, is a railway only potentially, and not in reality. Without production, no consumption, but also without consumption, no production. Since production would then be purposeless, consumption produces production in a double way. One, because a product whose real product only by being consumed. For example, a garment becomes a real garment only in the act of being worn. A house where no one lives is in fact not a real house. Thus, the product, unlike a mere natural object, proves itself to becomes a product only through consumption. Only by decomposing the product does the consumption give the product the finishing touch. For the product is the production, not as... Sorry, I was reading a footnote. Objectified activity, but rather only as object for the active subject. Because consumption creates the need for new production, that is, it creates the ideal, internally impelling cause for production in which it is presupposition. Consumption creates the motive for production. It also creates the object, which is active in production, as its determinate aim. If it is clear that production offers consumption its external object, it is therefore equally clear that consumption ideally posits the object of production as an internal image, as a need, as drive, and as purpose. It creates the object of production in the still subjective form. No production without a need, but consumption reproduces the need. Production, for its part, correspondingly, one, furnishes the material and the object for consumption. Consumption without an object is not consumption. Therefore, in this respect, production produces consumption. 2. But the object is not the only thing which production creates for consumption. Production also gives consumption its specificity, its character, its finish. Just as consumption gave the product its finish as a product, so does production give finish to consumption. Firstly, the object is not an object in general, but a specific object which must be consumed in a specific manner to be mediated in its turn by production itself. Hunger is hunger, but the hunger gratified by cooked meat eaten with a knife and fork is a different hunger from which bolts down raw meat with the aid of hand, nail, and tooth. Production thus produces not only the object, but also the manner of consumption, not only objectively, but also subjectively. Production thus creates the consumer. 3. Production not only supplies a material for the need, but it also supplies the need for the material. As soon as consumption emerges from its initial state of national crudity and immediacy, and if it remained at this stage, this will be because production itself has been arrested there. It becomes itself mediated as a drive by the object. The need which consumption feels for the object is created by the perception of it. The object of art, like every other product, creates a public which is sensitive to art and enjoys beauty. Production thus not only creates an object for the subject, but also a subject for the object. Thus, production produces consumption. 1. By creating the material for it. 2. By determining the manner of consumption. And 3. The products initially posited by as objects in the form of a need felt by the consumer. It thus produces the object of consumption, the manner of consumption, and the mode of consumption. Consumption likewise produces the product's inclination by beckoning him as an aim-determining need. That basically sums up the entire thing here. The identities between consumption and production thus appear threefold. 1. Immediate identity. Production is consumption, consumption is production, consumptive production, productive consumption. The political economists call both productive consumption, but then make it a further distinction. The first figure as reported, the second as productive consumption. All investigations into the first concern productive or unproductive labor. Investigations into the second concern productive or non-productive consumption. 2. And since that one appears as a means for the other, is mediated by the other. This is expressed as their mutual dependence, a movement which relates to them from another makes them appear indispensable to one another, but still leaves them external to each other. Production creates the material as external object for the consumption. Consumption creates the need as internal object as aim for production. Without production, no consumption. Without consumption, no production. This identity figures in economics in many different forms. 3. Not only is production immediately consumption and consumption immediately production, not only is production as means for consumption and consumption the aim of production, i.e. supplies the other with its object, production supplying the external object of consumption, consumption the conceived object of production, but also each of them, apart from being immediately the other and apart from mediating the other, in addition to this, creates the other in completing itself and creates itself as the other. consumption accomplishes the act of production only in completing the product as product by dissolving it, by consuming its independently material form, by raising the inclination developed in the first act of production through the need for repetition to its finished form. It is thus not only the concluding act in which the product becomes product, but also in which the producer becomes producer. On the other side, production produces consumption by creating a specific manner of consumption, and further by creating stimulus of consumption, the ability to consume as a need. This last identity, as determined under 3, is frequently cited in economics in the relation of demand and supply of objects and needs, of socially created and natural needs. Okay, this is like, if you didn't get it the first 2 times, this is the third explanation of the exact same thing. Thereupon, nothing simpler for a Hegelian than the posit production and consumption as identical, like being nothing. And that has been done not only by socialist belliterists, but by prosaic economists themselves, like say, in the form which one looks at the entire people, its production is its consumption, or indeed at humanity in the abstract. Storch demonstrates Say's error, namely that, e.g., a people does not consume its entire product, but also creates means of production, or fixed capital. To regard society as one single subject is, in addition, to look at it wrongly, speculatively. With a single subject, production and consumption appear as moments of a single act. The important thing to emphasize here is that whether production and consumption are viewed as the activity of one or the many individuals, they appear in any case a moment of one process in which production is the real point of departure, and hence also the predominant moment. Consumption, as urgency, as need, is itself an intrinsic moment of productive activity, but the latter is the point of departure for realization, and hence also its predominant moment. It is the act through which the whole process itself runs its course. The individual produces an object, and by consuming it, returns to himself, but returns as a product and self-reapproaching individual. Consumption thus appears as a moment of production. In society, however, the producer's relation to the product, once the latter is finished, is an external one, and its return to the subject depends on his relation to other individuals. It does not come into possession of directly, nor is its immediate appropriation his purpose when he produces in society. Distribution steps between the products and the producers, hence between production and consumption, to determine in accordance with social laws what the producer's share will be in the world of products. Okay, yeah, so he's basically saying, you can kind of just do a lazy Hegelian thing and just say production is consumption, because if you look at society as a subject, it appears like that, but they're saying there's another thing called distribution that exists to mediate it, and there's a lot of things within that need to be looked at. That's what he's saying here. Now, does distribution stand at the side of and outside production or at the side of and outside production as an autonomous sphere? You think it would say or there, whatever. Distribution in production. When one examines the usual works of economics, it is immediately striking that everything in them is posited doubly. For example, ground rent, wages, interest, and profit figure under distribution, while land, labor, and capital figure under production as agents of production. In the case of capital now, it is evident from the outset that it is posited doubly, 1, as an agent of production, and 2, as source of income, as a determinate specific form of distribution. Interest and profits thus also figure as such in production, and insofar as they are forms which capital increases, grows, hence moments of its own production. Interest and profit, as forms of distribution, presuppose capital as agent of production. There are modes of distribution whose presupposition is capital as agents of production. There are likewise modes of reproduction of capital. The category of wages, similarly, is the same as that which is examined under a different heading as wage labor. The characteristic which wage labor here possesses as an agent of production appears as a characteristic of distribution. If labor were not specified as wage labor, then the manner in which it shares in the products would not immediately appear as wages, as for example, under slavery. Finally, to take at once the most developed form of distribution, ground rent, by means of which landed property shares in the product, presupposes large-scale landed property, actual large-scale agriculture, as agents of production, and not by merely land as such, just as wages do not merely presuppose labor as such. The relation and modes of distribution thus appear merely as the agents of production. land as observe? As the observe, okay. An individual who participates in production in the form of wage labor shares the products in the results of production in the form of wages. The structure, Gilderung, of distribution is completely determined by the structure of production. Distribution is itself a product of production, not only in its object, but in that only the results of production can be distributed, but also in its form, and that the specific kind of participation in production determines the specific forms of production, i.e., the pattern of participation in distribution, is altogether an illusion to posit land in the production, ground rent in distribution, etc. Thus, economists such as Ricardo, who are the most frequently accused of focusing on production alone, have defined distribution as the exclusive object of economics because they instinctively conceive the former of distribution as the most specific expression into which the agents of production of a given society are cast. To the single individual, of course, distribution appears as a social law which determines his position within the system of production within which he produces, and which therefore precedes production. The individual comes into the world possessing neither capital nor land. Social distribution assigns him at birth to wage labor, but the situation of being assigned is itself a consequence of the existence of capital and landed property as independent agents of production. As regards whole societies, distribution seems to precede production and to determine it in yet another respect, almost as if it were a pre-economic fact. The conquering people divide the land among the conquerors, thus impose a certain distribution in form of property in land, and thus determines production. Or it enslaves the conquered and so makes slave labor the foundation of production. Or a people rises in revolution and smashes the great landed estates into small parcels, and hence by this new distribution gives production a new character. Or a system of laws assigns property and land to certain families in perpetuity, or distributes labor as a hereditary privilege, and thus confines it within certain castes. In all these cases, or as they are historically, it seems that distribution is not structured and determined by production, but rather the opposite, production by distribution. In the Shaoist conception, distribution appears as the distribution of products, and hence as further removed from and quasi-independence of production. But before distribution can be distribution of products, it is 1. The distribution of the instrument of production, and 2. Which is a futile further specification of the same relation, the distribution of the members of society among the different kinds of production, subsumption of the individuals under specific relations to production. The distribution of products is evidently only a result of this distribution, which is comprised within the process of production itself and determines the structure of production. To examine production while disregarding this internal distribution within it is obviously an empty abstraction, while conversely, the distribution of products follows by itself from this distribution, which forms an original moment of production. Ricardo, whose concern was to grasp the specific social structure of modern production, and who is the economist of production par excellence, declares for precisely that reason that not production, but distribution is the proper study of modern economics. This again shows the ineptitude of those economists who portray production as an eternal truth while banishing into history the realm of distribution. The question of the relation between this production determining distribution and production belongs evidently within production itself. If it is said that since production must begin with a certain distribution of the instruments of production, it follows that distribution, for at least in this sense, precedes and forms the presupposition of production, then the reply must be that production does indeed have its determinants and preconditions which form its movements. At the very beginning, these may appear spontaneous, natural, but by the process of production itself, they're transformed from natural into historic determinants. And if they appear to be to one epoch as natural presuppositions of production, they were its historic product for another. Within production itself, they're constantly being changed. The application of machinery, for example, changed the distribution of instruments of production as products for another. Within production itself, they're constantly being charged. The application of machinery, for example, changed the distribution of instruments of production as well as its products. Modern large-scale landed property is itself the product of modern commerce and of modern industry, as well as of the application of the latter to agriculture. The questions raised above of all reduce themselves in the last instance to the role-playing by general historical relations in production and the relations to the movement of history generally. The question evidently belongs within the treatment and investigation of production itself. Still, in the trivial form in which they are raised above, they can be dealt with equally briefly. In all cases of conquest, three things are possible. The conquered people subjugates the conquered under its own mode of production, such as the English in Ireland in this century, or partially in India, or it leaves the old mode intact and content with a tribute, or a reciprocal interaction takes place, whereby something new, a synthesis, arises, the German conquest in particular. In all cases, the mode of production, whether that of the conquering people, that of the conquered, or that emerging from the fusion of both, is decisive for the new distribution which arises. Although the latter appears as a presupposition of the new period of production, it is thus itself in turn a product of production, not only of historical production generally, but of the specific mode of production. The Mongols, with the devastations in Russia, were acting in accordance with their production, cattle raising, for which vast uninhabited spaces are a chief precondition. The German barbarians, who lived in isolation on land and for whom agriculture with bondsmen was a traditional production, could impose these conditions on the Roman provinces all the more easily as a concentration of landed property, which had taken place there, had already entirely overthrown the earlier agricultural relations. It is a received opinion that in certain periods people lived from pillage alone. But for pillage to be possible, there must be something to be pillaged, hence production, and the mode of pillage is itself in turn determined by the mode of production. A stock-jobbing nation, for example, cannot be pillaged in the same manner as a nation of cowherds. To steal a slave is to steal the instrument of production directly. But then the production of the country for which the slave is stolen must be structured to allow of slave labor, or, as in South America, a mode of production corresponding that to the slaves must be created. Law may perpetuate an instrument of production, such as land in certain families. These laws achieve economic significance only when large-scale landed property is in harmony with the society's production, such as in England. In France, small-scale agriculture survived despite the great landed estates, hence the latter were smashed by the revolution. But can laws perpetuate the small-scale allotment? Despite these laws, ownership is again becoming concentrated. The influence of laws in stabilizing relations of distribution, and hence their effect on production, requires to be determined in each specific instance. Exchange, finally, and circulation. Exchange in production. Circulation itself is merely a specific moment of exchange, or it is also exchange regarded in its totality. Insofar as exchange is merely a moment mediating between production with its production-determined distribution on one side and consumption on the other, but insofar as the latter itself appears as a moment of production, and to that extent is exchange obviously also included as a moment within the latter. It is clear, firstly, that the exchange of activities and abilities which takes place within production itself belongs directly to production and essentially constitutes it. The same holds secondly for the exchange of products, insofar as that exchange is the means of finishing the product and making it fit for direct consumption. To that extent, exchange is an act comprised within production itself. Thirdly, the so-called exchange between dealers and dealers is by very organization entirely determined by production, as well as being itself a producing activity. Exchange appears as independent of and indifferent to production only in the final phase where the product is exchanged directly for consumption. But there is no exchange without division of labor, whether the latter is spontaneous, natural, or already a product of historic development. 2. Private exchange presupposes private production. And 3. The intensity of exchange, as well as its extension and its manners, are determined by the development of and structure of production. For example, exchange between town and country, exchange in the country, in the town, etc. Exchange in all its moments thus appears as either directly comprised in production or determined by it. The conclusion we reach is not that production, distribution, and exchange and consumption are identical, but they all form members of a totality, distinctions within a unity. That's interesting. Let me highlight that. The production predominates not only over itself in the antithetical definition of production, but also over other moments as well. The process always returns to production to begin anew. That exchange and consumption cannot be predominant is self-evident. Likewise, distribution as distribution of products, while as distribution of the agents of production, is itself a moment of production. A definite production thus determines a definite consumption, distribution, and exchange, as well as definite relations between these different moments. Admittedly, however, in its one-sided form, production is itself determined by the other moments. For example, if the market, i.e. the sphere of exchange, expands, then production grows in quantity. However, in its one-sided form, production is itself determined by the other moments. For example, if the market, i.e. the sphere of exchange, expands, then production grows in quantity, and the division between its different branches becomes deeper, a change in distribution changes production, e.g. concentration of capital, different distribution of the population between town and country, etc. Finally, the needs of consumption determine production. Mutual interaction takes place between the different moments. This is the case with every organic whole. The method of political economy. When we consider a given country politico-economically, we begin with its population, its distribution among classes, town, country, the coast, the different branches of production, export and import, annual production and consumption, commodity prices, etc. It seems to be correct to begin with the real and the concrete, with the real precondition, thus to begin in economics, with the population, which is the foundation and subject of the entire social act of production. However, on closer examination, this proves false. The population is an abstraction, if I leave out, for example, the classes of which it is composed. The classes, in turn, are an empty phrase if I am not familiar with the elements of which they rest, e.g., wage labor, capital, etc. These latter, in turn, presuppose exchange, division of labor, prices, etc. For example, capital is nothing but wage labor, without value, money, price, etc. Thus, if I begin with the population, this would be a chaotic conception of the whole, and I would then, by means of further determination, move analytically towards even more simple concepts, from the imagined concrete towards an even thinner abstraction, until I arrived at the simplest determinations. This is an amazing and very important line. From there, the journey would have to be retreated until I finally arrived at the population again, but this time, not as a chaotic conception of the whole, but as a rich totality of many determinations and relations. The former is the path historically followed by economists at the time of its origins. The economists of the 17th century always begin with the living whole, with population, nation, state, several states, etc., but they always conclude by discovering, through analysis, a small number of determinate abstract general relations, such as division of labor, money, value, etc. As soon as these individual moments have been more or less firmly established and abstracted, there begin the economic system, which ascends from the simple relations such as labor, division of labor, need, exchange value, to the level of the state exchange between nations and the world market. The latter, which is obviously the scientifically correct method, the concrete, is concrete because it is the concentration of many determinations. Hence the unity of the diverse. It appears in the process of thinking, therefore, as a process of concentration, as a result not a point of departure, even though it is the point of departure in reality, and hence also the point of departure for observation and conception. Along with the first path, the full conception was evaporated to yield an abstract determination. Along with the second, the abstract determination leads towards a reproduction of the concrete way of thought. In this way, Hegel fell into the delusion of conceiving the real as the product of thought, concentrating itself, prohibiting its own depth, and unfolding itself out of itself by itself, whereas the method of rising from the abstract to the concrete is only the way in which the appropriation of the concrete reproduces it as a concrete in the mind. But there is by no means the process by which the concrete itself comes into being. For example, the simplest economic category, say exchange value, presupposes population. Moreover, a population producing a specific relation, as well as a certain kind of family or commune or state, etc. It can never exist other than as an abstract, one-sided relation within an already given, concrete living organism. As a category, by contrast, exchange value leads to an antediluvian existence, therefore, to the kind of consciousness, and this is characteristic of the philosophical consciousness for which conceptual thinking is the real human being, and for which the conceptual world as such is thus only the only reality. The movement of categories appears as the real act of production, which only, unfortunately, receives a jolt from the outside, whose product is the world. But this is again a tautology. This is correct insofar as the concrete totality is a totality of thoughts, concrete in thought, in fact a product of thinking and comprehending, but not in any way a product of the concept which thinks and generates itself outside or above the observation and conception. A product rather of the working up observation and conception into concepts. The totality as it appears in the head as a totality of thoughts is a product of a thinking head, which is appropriate in the world in the only way it can, a way different from the artistic, religious, practical, and mental appropriations of this world. The real subject retains its autonomous existence outside the head just as before, namely as long as the head's conduct is merely speculative, merely theoretical. Hence, in the theoretical method too, the subject, society, must always be kept in mind as the presupposition. But do not these simple categories also have an independent historical or natural existence predating the more concrete ones? That depends. Hegel, for example, correctly begins the philosophy of right with possession, but this being the subject's simplest juridical relation. But there's no possession preceding the family or the master-servant relation, which are far more concrete relations. However, it would be correct to say that there are families or clan groups which still merely possess, but have no property. The simple category, therefore, appears in relation to property as a relation to simple family or clan groups. In the higher society, it appears as the simpler relation of a developed organization, but the concrete substratum of which possession is a relation is always presupposed. One can imagine an individual savage as the possessing something, but in that case, possession is not just a juridical relation. It is incorrect that possession develops historically into the family. Possession rather always presupposes this more concrete juridical category. There would still always remain this much, however, namely that the simple categories are the expression of the relations within which the less developed concrete may have already realized itself before having posited the many-sided connection or relation which is mentally expressed in the more concrete category. While the more developed concrete preserves the same category as a subordinate relation, money may exist and did exist historically before capital existed, before banks existed, before wage labor existed, etc. Thus, in this respect, it may be said that the simpler category can express the dominant relation of a less developed whole, or else those subordinate relations of a more developed whole, which already had a historical existence before this whole developed in the direct expressed by a more concrete category. To that extent, the path of abstract thought, rising from the simple to the combined, would correspond to the real historic process. It may be said, on the other hand, that there are very developed, but nonetheless historically less mature, forms of society in which the highest form of economic economy, e.g. cooperation, a developed division of labor, etc., are found, even though there is no kind of money, like Peru. Among the Slav communities also, money in the exchange which determine it plays little to no role within the individual communities, but only on their boundaries, in traffic with others. It is simply wrong to place exchange at the center of communal society as the original constitutive element. It originally appears rather in the connection of the different communities with one another, not in the relation between the different members of a single community. This is exactly it. This is exactly it. Further, although money everywhere plays a role from very early on, it is nonetheless a predominant element in antiquity only within the confines of certain one-sided developed nations, trading nations, and even in the most advanced parts of the ancient world. Among the Greeks and Romans, the full development of money, which is presupposed in modern bourgeois society, appears only in the periods of their dissolution. This very simple category, then, makes a historic appearance in its full intensity only in the most developed conditions of society. by no means does it wade its way through all economic relations. For example, in the Roman Empire, at its highest point of development, the foundation remained taxes and payments in kind. The monetary system actually completely developed there only in the army, and it never took over the whole of labor. Thus, although the simple category may have existed historically before the more concrete, it can achieve its full, intensive, and extensive development precisely in the combined form of society, while the more concrete category was more fully developed in a less developed form of society. Labor seems a quite simple category. The conception of labor in this general form, as labor as such, is also immeasurably old. Nevertheless, when it is economically conceived in this simplicity, labor is as modern a category as are the relations which create these simple abstractions. The monetary system, for economically conceived in this simplicity, labor is as modern a category as are the relations with which create this simple abstraction. The monetary system, for example, still locates wealth altogether objectively as an external thing in money. Compared with this standpoint, the commercial or manufacture system took a great step forward by locating the source of wealth not in the object, but in the subjective community. In commercial and manufacturing activity, even though it is always conceives this activity within narrow boundaries, as money-making. In contrast to this system, that of the physiocrats posits a certain kind of labor, agriculture, as creator of wealth, and the object itself no longer appears in monetary disguise, but as the product in general, as the general result of labor. This product, as befits the narrowness of the activity, still always remains a naturally determined product, the product of agriculture, the product of the earth par excellence. It was an immense step forward for Adam Smith to throw down every limiting specification of wealth-creating activity, not only the manufacturing or commercial or agricultural labor, but one as well as the other, labor in general. With the abstract universality of wealth-creating activity, we now have the universality of the object defined as wealth, the products as such, or again labor as such, but labor as past objectified labor. How difficult and great was this transition may be seen from Adam Smith himself, from time to time, still falls back into the physiocratic system. Now it might seem that all that had been achieved thereby was to discover the abstract expression for the simplest and most ancient relations in which human beings, in whatever form of society, play the role of producers. This is correct in one respect, not in another. Indifference towards any specific kind of labor presupposes a very developed totality of real kinds of labor, of which no single one is largely predominant. As a rule, the most general abstraction arises only in the midst of the richest possible concrete development, where one thing appears as common to many to all. Then it ceases to be thinkable to a particular form alone. On the other side, the subtraction of labor as such is not merely the mental product of a concrete totality of labors. Indifference towards specific labors corresponds to a form of society in which individuals can with ease transfer from one labor to another, and where the specific kind is a matter of chance for them. Hence of indifference, not only the category labor, but also labor in reality has here become the means of creating wealth in general, and has ceased to be organically linked with the particular individuals in any specific form. Such a state of affairs is at its most developed in the most modern forms of existence of bourgeois society in the United States. Hence, then for the first time, the point of departure of modern economics, namely the abstraction of category labor as such, labor pure and simple, becomes true in practice. The simple abstraction with which modern economics places at the head of its discussion, and which expresses an immeasurably ancient relation, valid in all forms of society, nevertheless achieves practical truth as an abstraction only as a category of those modern society. One considered this indifference towards particular kinds of labor, which is a historic to be used for anything, in civilized people who apply themselves to everything, and then, in practice, the Russian indifference to the specific character of labor corresponds to being embedded by tradition within which a specific kind of labor from which only external influences can jar them loose. This example of labor shows strikingly how even the most abstract categories, despite their validity, precisely because of their abstractness from all epochs or nonetheless in the specific character of this abstraction, themselves likewise a product of historic relations, and possess their full validity only for and within these relations. Bourgeois society is the most developed and most complex historic organization of production. The categories which express its relations, the comprehension of its structure, thereby also allows insight into the structure and relation of production of all the vanished social formations out of whose ruins and elements it's built itself up, whose partly still unconquered remnant are carried along within it, whose mere nuances have developed explicit significance within it, etc. Human anatomy contains a key to the anatomy of the ape. Okay, this is a hype moment here. The intimations of a higher development among the subordinate animal species, however, can be understood only after the higher development is already known. The bourgeois economy thus supplied the key to the ancient one, but not all in the manner of those economists who smudge over historical differences see bourgeois relations in all forms of society. One can understand tribute, tithe, etc. if one is acquainted with ground rent, but one must not identify with them. Further, since bourgeois society is itself only a contradictory form of development, relations derived from earlier forms will often be found within it only as an entirely stunted form, or even travestied. For example, communal property, although it is true, therefore, that the categories of bourgeois economics possesses a truth for all forms of society, this is to be taken only with a grain of salt. They can contain them in a developed or stunted or caricatured form, but always with an essential difference. The so-called historical presentation of development is founded, as a rule, on the fact that the latest form regards the previous ones as steps leading up to itself, and since it is only rare, and only under quite specific conditions, able to criticize itself, leaving aside, of course, the historical period, which appears to themselves as times of decadence, is always conceived to them one-sidedly. The Christian religion was able to be an assistance in reaching an objective understanding of earlier mythologies only when its own self-criticism had been accomplished to a certain degree, so to speak, potentially. He writes it in Greek, I don't know why. Likewise, bourgeois economics arrives at an understanding of feudal ancient Oriental economics only after the self-criticism of bourgeois society had begun. Insofar as the bourgeois economy did not mythologically identify itself altogether with the past, its critique of the previous economics, notably of feudalism, with which it was still engaged in direct struggle, resembled the critique with which Christianity leveled against paganism, or that of Protestantism against Catholicism. That was a really dense and powerful passage that should be looked at for sure. In the succession of the economic categories, as in any other historical social science, it must not be forgotten that their subject, here modern bourgeois society, is always what is given in the head as well as in reality, and that these categories, therefore, express the forms of being, the characteristics of existence, and often only individual sides of the specific society, the subject, and that therefore the society by no means begins only at the point where one can speak of it as such. This holds for science as well. This is to be kept in mind because it will shortly be decisive for the order and sequence of the categories. For example, nothing seems more natural than to begin with ground rent, with landed property, since this is bound up with the earth and the source of all production and all being, and with the first form of production of all more or less settled societies, agriculture. But nothing would be more erroneous. In all forms of society, there is one specific kind of production which predominates over the rest, whose relation thus assign rank and influence to the others. It is a general illumination which bathes all other colors and modifies their particularity. It is a particular ether which determines the specific gravity of every being which is materialized within it. For example, with pastoral peoples, merely hunting and fishing people lie outside of the point where real development begins. That's a hard line. I love that line. Certain forms of tillage occur among them, sporadic ones. Landed property is determined by this. It is held in common and retains this form to a greater or lesser degree according to the greater or lesser degree of attachment displayed by these peoples to their tradition, like the communal property of the Slavs. Among people of a settled agriculture, the settling already a great step, where this predominates as in antiquity in the feudal order, even industry, together with its organization in the forms of property corresponding to it, has a more or less landed proprietary character. Is either completely dependent on it, as among the earlier Romans, or, as in the Middle Ages, imitates, within the city and its relations, the organization of the land. In the Middle Ages, capital itself, apart from pure money capital, in the form of the traditional artisan, tools, etc., has this landed proprietary character. In bourgeois society, it is the opposite. Agriculture, more and more, becomes merely a branch of industry and is entirely dominated by capital. Ground rent likewise. In all forms where landed property rules, the natural relation is still predominant. In those where capital rules, the social, historically created element, ground rent cannot be understood without capital, but capital can certainly be understood without ground rent. Capital is the all-dominating economic power of bourgeois society. It must form the starting point as well as the finishing point. It must be dealt with before landed property. After both have been examined in particular, the interrelation must be examined. It would therefore be unfeasible and wrong to let the economic category follow one another in the same sequence as that in which they were historically decisive. Their sequence is determined rather by their relation to one another in modern bourgeois society, which is precisely the opposite of that which seems to be their natural order, or which corresponds to historical development. The point is not the historical position of the economic relationships in the succession of different forms of society, even less in their sequence in the idea, pardon, a muddy notion of historical movement, rather their order within modern bourgeois society. The purity, abstract specificity in which trading peoples, Phoenicians, Carthaginians, appear in the Old World is determined precisely by the predominance of the agricultural people. Capital, as trading capital, or as money capital, appears in this abstraction precisely where capital is not yet the predominant element of societies. Lombards, Jews, take up the same position towards the agricultural society of the Middle Ages. As a further example of the divergent positions between the same categories can occupy in different social stages, one of the last forms of bourgeois society, joint stock companies. These also appear, however, at its beginning in the greater privileged monopoly trading companies, but I was told Marx didn't know about monopoly capitalism. The concept of national wealth creeps into the work of the economists of the 17th century, continuing partly with those of the 18th, in the form of a notion of wealth is created only to enrich the state, and that its power is proportionate to its wealth. This is still unconsciously hypocritical form in which the wealth and the production of wealth proclaim themselves as the purpose of the modern states, and regarded these states henceforth only as a means for the production of wealth. The order obviously has to be one. Okay, this is very important here. This is a very important part here. This is what the entire thing is leading up to. The order that you analyze political economy has to be one, the general abstract determinants which attain in more or less all forms of society, but in above all explain sense. 2. The categories which make up the inner structure of bourgeois society, and on which the fundamental classes rest: capital, wage labor, landed property, the interrelation, town and country. The 3 great social classes, exchange between them, circulation, credit system, private. 3. Concentration of bourgeois society in the form of the state, viewed in relation to itself, the unproductive classes, taxes, state debt, public credit, the population, the colonies, immigration. 4. The international relation of production, international division of labor, international exchange, export and import, rate of exchange. If only you got time to write that, that would have been amazing. And 5. The world market and crises. That's what the whole, the whole process, the whole point of what he's writing, because remember to start with some of the Robinsonades. What were those Robinsonades about in context? There was the big crash. It was the first big crash in capitalism's history, I think, or something like that, okay? And everyone, all these economists, were putting together all these explanations for why it happened, what's going on, how to solve it, what was wrong with our policies, what can fix it. So Marx's project is to show that it's not policy. But once you notice all the stuff he said in this about the relation between distribution, production, exchange, consumption, all that, okay, once you understand the relation between all these things, then, okay, and then you put it all together like this, then you can make an analysis, okay, of these relations, and then you can figure out the core contradiction of the society, okay, and then from there, you can derive, what one must do potentially to resolve this contradiction, much like happened in past societies. This is his whole project laid out here, okay? And crises is the penultimate thing that he wants to talk about. He never got around to it, though, okay? So people who are like, oh, well, crisis there, you may not need it. It's like reform or whatever, or it's wrong or so, I don't know. No. The whole purpose of everything he's writing is to understand crises and what they say. That's that's literally the thing that inspired him, because that's when things go wrong. That's the moment of rupture. That's where things go wrong. That's where you have to take a step back and you have to look at what happened, okay? And that's why he's doing this. It's very meta in that way. Production. Means of production in relations of production. Relations of production in relations of circulation. Forms of the state and forms of consciousness in relation to relations of production and circulation. Legal relations. Family relations. Another recognized title. Anyways. Notabene. I don't know what that means. In regards to points to be mentioned here and not to be forgotten. 1. War developed earlier than peace. The way in which certain economic relations, such as wage labor, machinery, etc., develop earlier, owing to war in an armies, etc., than in the interest of bourgeois society. The relations of production, force in relations of exchange, also especially vividly in the army. 2. Relations of previous ideal historiography to the real, namely of the so-called cultural histories, which are only histories of religion and of the state. On the occasion, something can also be said about the various kinds of previous historiography, the so-called objective, subjective, moral, among other things, the philosophical. 3. Secondary and tertiary matters in general, derivation, inherited, not original relations of production, influence here of the international relations. 4. Accusations about the materialism of this conception, relation to naturalistic materialism. 5. Dialectic of the concepts of productive force, means of production, and relations of production, a dialectic whose boundaries are to be determined, and which does not suspend the real difference. 6. The uneven development of the material production relative to the artistic development. In general, the concept of progress, not to be conceived in the usual abstractness, modern art, etc. This is disproportionate, not as important or so difficult to grasp as within practical social relations themselves, e.g., the relations of education, relation of the United States to Europe. But the really difficult point to discuss here is how relations of production develop unevenly as legal relations. Thus, the relation of Roman private law, this less case the criminal and public law, to modern production. 7. This conception appears as necessary development, but the legitimation of chance, how, of freedom among other things, influence of the means of communication, world history has always existed. History is world history, a result. 8. The point of departure, obviously, from the material natural characteristic, subjective and objective, tribes, races, etc. 1. In the case of the arts, it is well known that certain periods of their flowering are out of all proportion to the general development of society, hence also to the material foundation, the skeletal structure, if it were, of its organization. For example, the Greeks compared to the moderns, or also Shakespeare, it is even recognized that certain formulas of art, such as the epic, can no longer be produced in their world, epic making classical stature, as soon as the production of art as such begins. That is, the different kinds of art are within the realm of the arts. That is, that certain significant forms within the realm of the arts are possible only at an undeveloped stage of artist development, If this is the case with relations between different kinds of art within the realm of the arts, it is already less puzzling that it is the case in the relation of the entire realm of the general development of society. The difficulty consists only in the general formulation of these contradictions. As soon as they've been specified, they are already clarified. Let us take the relation of Greek art to then of Shakespeare to the present time. It is well known that Greek mythology is not the only arsenal of Greek art, but also its foundation. It is the view of nature and the social relations on which the Greek art imagination, and hence Greek mythology, is based, possibly with self-acting mule spindles in railways and locomotives and electrical telegraphs. I don't. That's. Okay. What chance has Vulcan against Robert and Co., Jupiter against the lightning rod, and Hermes against credit mobilier? All mythology overcomes and dominates the shapes, the forces of nature, and the imagination, and by the imagination, it therefore vanishes, with the advent of real mastery over them. What becomes of Fama alongside printing, house squares, Greek art presupposes Greek mythology, i.e. natural and social forms, already reworked in an unconscious artistic way by popular imagination. This is its material, not any mythology whatsoever, i.e. not an arbitrary, chosen, unconsciously artistic reworking of nature, here meaning everything objective, hence including society. Egyptian mythology could never have been the foundation or the womb of Greek art, but in any case a mythology. Hence, in no way a social development which excludes all mythologizing relations to natural, which therefore demand of the artist not dependence on mythology. From another side, is Achilles possible with the powder or lead, or the Iliad with the printing press, not to mention the printing machine? Do not the song and saga and muse necessarily come to an end with the printer's bar, hence and do not necessary conditions of epic poetry vanish? But the difficulty lies not in the understanding that Greek art and epic are bound up with certain forms of social development. The difficulty is that they still afford us artistic pleasure, and that in certain respects they count as a norm and unattainable as model. A man cannot become a child again, or he becomes childish, but does he not find joy in the child's naivety? He must himself not strive to reproduce its truth at a higher stage? Does not the true character of each epoch come alive in the nature of its children? Why should not the historical child of humanity, its most beautiful unfolding as a stage, never to return, exercise an eternal charm? There are unruly children and precocious children. Many of the old people belong in this category. The Greeks were normal children. The charm of their art for us is not in contradiction or to the undeveloped stage of society on which it grew. It is its result rather, and is inextricably bound up rather, with the fact that the unripe social conditions under which it arose and could alone arise can never return. Alright, I'm going to interject here and try and summarize the key points of that, since that was pretty dense and long. So, social reality itself is historically produced. That is to say, the human being is in its most literal sense a political animal which individuates itself only in the midst of society. The idea of production by an isolated individual outside society is as much an absurdity as the development of language without individuals living together and speaking with each other. Capital is, among other things, also an instrument of production, also objectified past labor. What this means is that one cannot leave out the specific quality which alone makes the entrance of production and stores up labor into capital. On their own, capital is a historically special form of these things. The same physical object can exist in feudalism or slavery while playing a different social role. A hammer, nor a machine, is automatically capital. They're dead labor, and they will become capital within a specific social relation. Every form of production creates its own legal relations and forms of government. This doesn't mean that these things are, fake or illusory, but they arise from social production and are historically grounded forms of social life. Economists treat law, property, and how we specifically produce things as separate, independent processes only connected by chance, when we see that they are in fact parts of a greater totality of capitalism. Most people think production entails physically manufacturing objects. but in actuality it entails the production of social life itself. Production thus produces not only the object, but also the manner of consumption, the subject of consumption, and in turn the consumer himself. Yeah, it creates the object and the subject. Capitalism doesn't exist to satisfy pre-existing needs at all. Instead, it's the very process that produces the needs and desires that it satisfies. Hunger is hunger, but the hunger gratified by cooked meat eaten with a knife and fork is a different kind of hunger. So even needs are historically mediated without a purely natural consumption outside society. Products only become real socially through use, and so production reproduces people while consumption reproduces labor power. Consumption creates new needs, which drive new production. Reformists focus on distribution being unfair, but distribution itself is produced by production relations. The structure of distribution is completely determined by the structure of production. The wage relation is what generates the class structure that leads to this incongruity in distribution. The concrete is concrete because it is the concentration of many determinations, hence unity of the diverse. What does that mean? Reality is not made by isolated facts or empiricism. Instead, society is structured totality of relations. Reality is as well not created by concepts. We start from the messy concrete world and abstract essential relations away from it to reconstruct the whole conceptuality of it. The most general abstractions arise only in the midst of the richest possible concrete development. Labor in general seems timeless, but it is only the capitalist relation that makes labor interchangeable enough for this abstraction to become socially real. An abstraction is not merely in our heads, as sometimes society itself becomes abstract. Capitalism actually makes labor abstract in reality, as you have interchangeable jobs in universal markets that can modify labor power in just such a way. Production predominates, but exchange, distribution, and consumption affects production. Production takes the primary role because society must reproduce material life, but within this totality, there's internal dominance where all these moments of the cycle interact to produce each other. Human anatomy contains the key to the anatomy of the ape. That was kind of a confusing line for me because it makes it seem like the human is the completion of the ape, like teleologically, but what he really means is that these advanced forms can help explain earlier forms as their full appearance helps clarify the mystery of the processes that led to them. And so categories are historically and socially mediated, they're not biological realities. Human beings transform natural society, and this is why Marxist materialism is historical materialism. It's not like, I knew a guy who's like a Marxist humanist, and he says, no, Marx, that's Engels or something. Marx is a naturalist. And he's like, naturalism is the broader category this is under. It's not a thing, I don't know. Anyways. B. Society and the individual. Product and capital, value and capital, production. Nothing is more erroneous than the manner in which economists, as well as socialists, regard society in relation to economic conditions. Proudhon, for example, replies to Basquiat by saying for society, the difference between capital and product does not exist. This difference is entirely subjective and related to individuals. Thus, he calls subjective precisely what is social, and he calls society a subjective abstraction. The difference between product and capital is exactly this, that the product expresses as capital a particular relation belonging to a historical form of society. This so-called contemplation, from the standpoint of society, means nothing more than the overlooking of differences which express the social relations of bourgeois society. Society does not consist of individuals, but expresses the sum of interrelations, the relation within which these individuals stand. As if someone were to say, seen from the perspective of society, there are no slaves and no citizens. Both are human beings, rather they are outside outside society. To be a slave, to be a citizen, are social characteristics, relations between human beings A and B. Human being A, as such, is not a slave. He is a slave in and through society. What Mr. Proudhon here says about capital and production means for him that from the viewpoint of society, there is no difference between capitalist and worker, a difference which exists precisely only from the standpoint of society. C. The dynamics of capital. What the worker exchanges with capital is his labor itself, the capacity of disposing over it. He divests himself of it. What he obtains as price is the value of this divestment. He exchanges value-positing activity for a predetermined value, regardless of the result of his activity. Now, how is its value determined? By the objectified labor contained in his commodity. This commodity exists in his vitality in order to maintain this from one day to the next. We are not yet dealing with the working class, i.e. the replacement for wear and tear, so that it can maintain itself as a class, since the worker here confronts capital as a worker, i.e. as a presupposed perennial subject, and not yet as a mortal individual of the working species. He has to consume a certain quantity of food to replace his used up blood, etc. He receives no more than an equivalent. Thus tomorrow, after the completed exchange, and only after he has formally completed the exchange, does he execute it in process of production. His laboring capacity exists in the same mode as before. He has received an exact equivalent, because the price of which he has obtained leaves him in possession of the same exchange value he had before. Capital has paid him the amount of objectified labor contained in his vital forces. Capital has consumed it, and because it did not exist as a thing, but as a capacity of a living being, the worker can, owing to the specific nature of his commodity, the specific nature of the life process, resume the exchange anew. Since we're dealing here not with any particularly qualified labor, but with labor in general, simple labor, we are here not yet concerned with the fact that there is more labor objectified in his immediate existence than is contained in his mere vitality, such as the labor time necessary to pay for the products necessary to maintain his vitality, namely the values he has consumed in order to produce a specific laboring capacity. A special skill, and the value of these shows itself in the costs necessary to produce a similar laboring skill. If one day's work were necessary in order to keep one worker alive for one day, then capital would not exist, because the working day would then exchange for its own product, so that capital could not realize itself, and hence could not maintain itself as capital. The self-preservation of capital is its self-realization. If capital also had to work in order to live, then it would not maintain itself as capital, but as labor. Property in raw materials and instruments of labor would be merely nominal. Economically, they would belong to the workers as much to the capitalist, since they would create value for the capitalist only insofar as he himself were a worker. He would relate to them, therefore, not as capital, but as a simple material and means of labor, like the worker himself does in the production process. If, however, only half of the working day is necessary in order to keep one worker alive one whole day, then the surplus value of this product is self-evident because the capitalist has paid the price of only 1 hour, half a working day, but has obtained a whole day objectified in the product. Thus, has exchanged nothing for the second half of the working day. The only thing which can make him into a capitalist is not exchange, but rather a process through which he obtains objectified labor time. Dave Harvey needs to read this line. Value without exchange. Half the working day costs capital nothing. It thus obtains a value for which it has given no equivalent. And the multiplication of values can take place only if value in excess of the equivalent has been obtained, hence created. Surplus value in general is value in excess of the equivalent. The equivalent, by definition, is only the identity of value with itself. Hence, surplus value can never sprout out of the equivalent, nor can it do so organically out of circulation. It has to arise from the production process of capital itself. The matter can also be expressed in this way. If the worker needs only half a working day in order to live a whole day, then, in order to keep alive as a worker, he needs to work only half a day. The second half of the labor day is forced labor, surplus labor. What appears as surplus value on the capitalist side appears identically on the worker side as surplus labor in excess of his requirements as a worker, hence in excess of his immediate requirements for keeping himself alive. The great historic quantity of capital is to create the surplus labor, superfluous labor from the standpoint of the mere use value. Mere subsistence and its historical destiny is fulfilled as soon as, on one side, there have been such a development of needs that surplus labor, above and beyond necessity, has itself become a general need arising out of individual needs themselves, and, on the other side, what severe discipline of capital, acting on succeeding generations, has developed a general industriousness as the general property of the new species, and finally, when the development of the productive power of labor, which capital incessantly whips onward with its unlimited mania for wealth, and the sole condition in which mania can be realized, have flourished to the stage where the possession and preservation of general wealth requires a lesser labor time of society as a whole, and where the laboring society relates scientifically to the process of its progressive reproduction in a constantly greater abundance. Hence, where labor in which a human being does what a thing could do has ceased. Accordingly, capital and labor relate to each other here like money and commodity. The former is the general form of wealth, the other only the substance destined for immediate consumption. Capital's cease of striving towards the general form of wealth drives labor beyond the limits of its natural paltriness, and thus creates the material elements for the development of the rich individuality, which is all cited in the production as in its consumption, and whose labor also therefore appears no longer as labor, but as the full development of activity itself, in which natural necessity, in its direct form, has disappeared, because a historically created need has taken the place of a natural one. This is why capital is productive, an essential relation for the development of the social productive forces. It ceases to exist as such only where the development of these productive forces themselves encounter its barrier in capital itself. The Times of November 1857 contains an utterly delightful cry of outrage on the part of the West Indian plantation owner. This advocate analysis the greater moral indignation as a plea for the reintroduction of black slavery, how the Quashies, the free blacks of Jamaica, content themselves with producing only what is strictly necessary for their own consumption, and alongside this use value, regard loafing, indulgence in idleness, as the real luxury good. How do they not care a damn for the sugar and fixed capital investment in the plantation, but rather observe the planters' impending bankruptcy with an ironic grin of malicious pleasure, and even exploit their acquired Christianity as an embellishment for this mood of malicious glee and indolence? They have ceased to be slaves, but not in order to become wage laborers, but instead self-sustaining peasants, working for their own consumption. As far as they're concerned, capital does not exist as capital, because autonomous wealth as such can exist only either on the basis of direct forced labor, slavery, or indirect forced labor, wage labor. Wealth confronts direct forced labor not as capital, but rather as a relation of domination. Thus, the relation of domination is the only thing which is reproduced on this basis, for which wealth itself has value only as gratification, not as wealth itself, and which can therefore never create general industriousness. We shall return to this relation of slavery and wage labor. Alright, just to interject quickly here. So, what the worker exchanges with capital is his labor itself, the capacity of disposing over it, labor power, and he receives an equivalent value. Workers are not robbed at the moment of exchange in the sense of simple cheating. Exploitation occurs when labor power produces more value than it costs to reproduce itself. Surplus value can never sprout out of an equivalent, nor can it do so originally out of circulation. It has to arise from the production process of capital itself. The great historic quality of capital is to create this surplus labor, and this is why capital is productive. It is an essential relation for the development of social reproductive forces. Capitalism is a force that historically revolutionizes production and creates world markets, social interdependence, and the material basis that will eventually, be required for communism. However, capitalism ceases to exist as such only where the development of these productive forces themselves encounter its barrier in capital itself. Autonomous wealth as such can only exist either on the basis of direct forced labor, slavery, or indirect forced labor, wage labor. Both slavery and wage labor, while obviously identical, both involve surplus extraction under domination, though through radically different mechanisms, hence his example of Jamaica there. The development and exchange of capital. Once production founded on capital is presupposed, money has become transformed into capital actually only at the end of the first production process, which resulted in its reproduction and in the new production of surplus capital. 1. Surplus capital I, One, however, is itself posited, realized as money, while in the realized as surplus capital only when it has produced surplus capital too, which is as soon as those presuppositions of money, while in the process of passing over into capital, which still lie outside the movement of real capital, have vanished, and when capital has therefore itself posited and posited in accordance with its immanent essence, the conditions which form its point of departure in production, then the condition that the capitalist, in order to posit himself as capital, must bring value in the circulation, which he created with his own labor, or by some other means, accepting only already available previous wage labor, belongs among the antediluvian conditions of capital, belonging to its available to its historic presuppositions, which precisely as such historic presuppositions are past and gone, and hence belong to the history of its formulation, but in no way to its contemporary history, i.e. not to the real system of the mode of production ruled by it. While, e.g., the flight of serfs to the cities is one of the historic conditions and presuppositions of urbanism, it is not a condition, not a moment of the reality of developed cities, but belongs rather to the past presuppositions, to the presuppositions of their becoming, which are suspended in their being. The conditions and presuppositions of the becoming of the arising of capital presupposes precisely that it is not yet in being, but merely in becoming. They therefore disappear as real capital arises. Capital, which itself on the basis of its own reality posits the conditions for its realization. Thus, while the process in which money or value for itself originally becomes capital presupposes on the part of the capitalist an accumulation, perhaps by means of savings garnered from products in value created by his own labor, which he has undertaken as a non-capitalist, while the presupposition under which money becomes capital appears as given, external presuppositions for the arising of capital. Nonetheless, as soon as capital has become capital as such, it creates its own presupposition, the possession of the real conditions of the creation of new values without exchange, by means of its own production process. These presuppositions, which originally appear as conditions of its own becoming, and hence could not spring from its action as capital, now appear as results of its own realization. Reality, as posited by it, not as conditions of it arising, but the results of its presence. It no longer proceeds from presuppositions in order to become, but rather it is itself presupposed, and proceeds from itself to create the conditions of its maintenance and growth. Therefore, the conditions which preceded the creation of surplus capital 1, or which express the becoming of capital, do not fall into the sphere of that mode of production for which capital served as the presupposition, as a historical prelude to its becoming. They lie behind it, just as the process is by means of which the earth made the transition from liquid seas of fire and vapor to the present form now lie beyond its life as finished earth. That is, individual capitals can continue to arise by means of hoarding, but the hoarding is transformed into capital only by means of the exploitation of labor. The bourgeois economist, who regards capital as an external and natural, not historical form of production, then attempt at the same time to legitimize it again by formatting the conditions of its becoming as conditions of its contemporary realization. The moment in which capitalists still appropriate as non-capitalists, because he is still becoming as the very conditions in which he appropriates as capitalist. These attempts at apologetics demonstrate a guilty conscience, as well as the inability to bring the mode of appropriation of capital as capital into harmony with the general laws of property proclaimed by capital society itself. On the other hand, much more important for us is that our method indicates the period, the points where historical investigation must enter in, where bourgeois economy, as a merely historical form of the production process, points beyond itself to earlier historical modes of production. In order to develop the law of bourgeois economy, therefore, it is not necessary to write the real history of the relations of production, but the correct observation and deductions of these laws as having themselves become, in history, always leading to primary equations, like the empirical numbers in natural science, which point towards a past lying behind this system. These indications, together with the correct grasp of the present, then also offer the key to the understanding of the past, a work in its own right, which is to be helped we shall be able to undertake as well. This correct view likewise leads at the same time to the points at which suspension of the present form of production relations gives sign of its becoming, foreshadowings of the future. Just as on one side, the pre-bourgeois phases appear as merely historical, suspended presuppositions, so do the contemporary conditions of production likewise appear as engaged in suspending themselves and hence in pausing the historic presuppositions of a new state of society. Now, if we initially examine the relations, such as has become value have become capital, and living labor confronting it as a mere use value, so the living labor appears as a mere means to realize objectified dead labor, to penetrate it with an animating soul while losing its own soul to it, and having produced as the end product alien wealth on one side, and on the other the plenary, which is living labor's capacities, sole possession. When the matter is simply this, that the process itself and by itself posits to an alien, and if capital were willing to pay it without making it labor, it would enter the bargain with pleasure. Thus, labor's capacities own labor is as alien to it, and then it really is as regards to its direction, as are material and instrument, which is why the product then appears to it as a combination of alien material, alien instruments, and alien labor as alien property, and why after production it has become poorer by the life forces expanded out, but otherwise begins the drudgery anew, existing as a mere subjective labor capacity separate from the conditions of its life. The recognition of the product as its own, and the judgment that its separation from the renditions of its realization is improper, forcibly imposed, is an enormous advance in the conditions of the realization is advance in awareness itself. The product of the mode of production resting on capital, and as much the knell to its doom, as with the slave's awareness that he cannot be the property of another with his consciousness of itself as a person, the existence of slavery becomes a merely artificial, vegetative existence, and ceases to be able to prevail as the basis of production. However, if we consider the original relation before the entry of money into the self-realization process, then various conditions appear which have to have arisen or been given historically for money to become capital and labor to become capital positing, capital creating wage labor here in the strict economic sense in which we use it here and no other, and we will later have to distinguish it from other forms of labor for day wages, is capital positing capital producing labor, i.e. living, which produces both the objective conditions of its realization as an activity as well as the objective moments of its being as labor capacity, and produces them as alien powers opposite itself as value for themselves independent of it. The essential conditions are themselves posited in relation as it appears originally one, on the side of the presence of living labor capacity as a merely subjective existence, separating from the conditions of living labor, as well as from the means of existence, the necessary goods, the means of self-preservation of living labor capacity, the living possibility of labor on one side, and this complete abstraction. 2. The value of or objectified labor found on the other side must be an accumulation of use values sufficiently large to furnish the objective conditions not only for the production of the products or a value required to reproduce or maintain living labor capacity, but also for the absorption of surplus labor to supply the objective material for the latter. 3. A free exchange, money circulation, between both sides, between the extremes, a relation founded on exchange values, not on the master-servant relation, hence production, which does not directly furnish the producer with his necessaries, but which is mediated through exchange, and which cannot therefore usurp alien labor directly, but must buy it, exchange it from the worker himself. Finally, 4. One side, the side representing the objective conditions of labor in the form of independent values for themselves, must present itself as value, and must regard the pausing of value, self-realization, money-making as the ultimate purpose, not direct consumption or of the creation of use value. So long as both sides exchange their labor with one another in the form of objectified labor, the relation is impossible. It is likewise impossible if living labor capacity appears as the property of the other side. Hence, as not engaged in exchange, the fact that slavery is possible at individual points within the bourgeois system of production does not contradict this. However, slavery is then possible there only because it does not exist at other points and appears as an anomaly opposite to the bourgeois system itself. The conditions under which the relation appears as the origin, or which appear as the historic presuppositions of its becoming, reveal at first glance a two-sided character. On one side, dissolution of lower forms of living labor, on the other, dissolution of happier forms of the same. The first presupposition to begin with is that the relation of slavery or serfdom has been suspended. Living labor capacity belongs to itself and has disposition over the expenditure of its forces through the exchange. Both sides confront each other as persons. Formally, the relief has the equality and freedom of exchange as such. As far as concerns the legal relation, the fact that this form is a mere semblance and a deceptive semblance appears as an external matter. What the free worker sells is always nothing more than the specific particularity measure of the force expenditure. Worker sells is always nothing more force expenditure. Labor capacity as a totality is greater than every particular expenditure. He sells the particular expenditure of force to a particular capitalist whom he confronts as an independent individual. It is clear that this is not his relation to the existence of capital as capital, i.e. to the capitalist class. Nevertheless, in this way, everything touches on the individual. Real person leaves him a wide field of choice of arbitrary will, and hence a formal freedom. In the slave relation, he belongs to the individual particular owner, and he is his laboring machine. As a totality of force expenditure, as labor capacity, he is a thing belonging to another, and hence does not relate as subject to his particular expenditure of force, nor to the act of living labor. In the serf relation, he appears as a moment of property in land itself, is an appendage of the soil, exactly like a draught cattle. In the slave relation, the worker is nothing but a living labor machine, which therefore has a value for others, or rather is a value. The totality of the free worker's labor capacity appears to him as his main property, as one of his moments over which he, a subject, exercises domination, and which he maintains by expending it. This has to be developed later under the wage labor. The exchange of objectified labor for living labor does not yet constitute either capital on one side or wage labor on the other. The entire class of so-called services, from the boot black up to the king, falls into this category. Likewise, the free day laborer, whom we encounter sporadically in all places where either the Oriental community or the Western commune, consisting of free landowners, dissolves into individual elements. As a consequence of increase of population, release of prisoners of war, actions by which the individual is impoverished and loses the objective conditions of his self-sustaining labor, owing to the division of labor, etc. If A exchanges value or money, i.e. objectified labor, in order to obtain a service from B, i.e. living labor, then this can belong. 1. Within the relation of simple circulation, both in fact exchange only use values with one another. One exchange necessaries the other labor, a service which the other wants to consume. Either directly, personal service, or he furnishes him the material, etc., from which with his labor, with the objectifications of his labor, he makes a use value designated for A's consumption. For example, when the peasant takes a wandering tailor of the kind that existed in times past into his house and gives him the material to make clothes with, or if I give him money to a doctor to patch up my health, what is important in these cases is the service to which both do for one another. Do ut facias here appears on quite the same level as facio ut des or do ut des. Let's see what that means. I give you that you may do. I do that you may give. I give that you may give. That's what that translates to. The man who takes the cloth I supplied to him makes me an article of clothing out of it, gives me a use value. But instead of giving it directly, in objective form, he gives it in the form of activity. I give him a completed use value. He completes another for me. The difference between previous objectified labor and living present labor here appears as a mere formal difference between the different tenses of labor at one time in the perfect and at another in the present. It appears in fact as a merely formal difference, a difference mediated by division of labor and by exchange, whether B himself produces the necessaries on which he has to subsist, or whether he obtains them from A, and instead of producing the necessaries himself, produces an article of clothing in exchange for which he obtains them from A. In both cases, he can take possession of the use value possessed by A only by giving him an equivalent for it, which in the last analysis always resolves itself into its own living labor, regardless of the objective form it may adopt, whether before the exchange is concluded or as a consequence of it. Now the article of clothing not only contains a specific form-giving labor, a specific form of usefulness imparted on the cloth by the movement of labor, but it contains also a certain quantity of labor, hence not only use value, but value generally. Value is such, but this value does not exist for A, since he consumes the article and is not a clothes dealer. He has therefore bought the labor not as a value-positing labor, but as an activity which creates utility. Use value in case of the personal service is. But this use value is consumed as such without making the transition from the form of movement into the form of the object. If, as is frequently the case in simple relations, the performer of the service does not obtain money, but direct use values themselves, then it no longer even seems as if value were not being dealt in one or the other side. Merely use values. But even given that A pays money for the service, this is not a transformation of his money into capital, but rather the pausing of his money as a mere medium of circulation. In order to obtain an object for consumption, a specific use value, this act is for that reason not an act which produces wealth, but the opposite, one which consumes wealth. The point for A is not the objectification in the cloth of labor as such of a certain amount of labor time, hence value, but rather the satisfaction of a certain need. Here A sees his money not realized, but devalued in it, in its transposition from the form of value into that of use value. Labor is here exchanged not as use value for value, but as itself a particular use value, as value for use. The more frequently A repeats the exchange, the poorer does he become. This exchange is not an act of wealth getting for him, not an act of value creation, but of devaluation of the value he has in hand in his possession. The money which A here exchanges for living labor, service in kind, or service objectified in a thing, is not capital, but revenue. Money is medium of circulation in order to obtain use value, money in which the form of value is posited as merely vanishing, not money which will preserve and realize itself as such through the acquisition of labor. Exchange of money as revenue, as a mere medium of circulation for living labor, can never posit money as capital, nor therefore labor as wage labor in the economic sense. A lengthy disquisition is not required to show that to consume, or spend money, is not the same as to produce money in situations in which the greatest part of surplus labor appears as agricultural labor, and where the owner of the land therefore appears as owner both of surplus labor and of the surplus product. It is the revenue of the owner of the land which forms the labor fund for the free workers of the worker in manufactures, here handcrafts, as opposed to the agricultural laborers. The exchange with them is a form of consumption of the owner of the land. He divides another part of this revenue directly, for personal services, often only the illusion of services, with a heap of retainers. In Asiatic societies, where the monarch appears as the exclusive proprietor of the agricultural surplus product, whole cities arise, which are at the bottom nothing more than wandering encampments from the exchange of his revenue with the free hands, as Stewart calls them. There is nothing of wage labor in this relation, but it can stand in opposition to slavery and serfdom through need not do so. 4. It always repeats itself under various forms of the overall organization of labor. To the extent that money mediates this exchange, the determination of prices will become important on both sides, but it will do so for A only insofar as he does not want to pay too much for the use value of the labor, not insofar as he is concerned with its value. The essence of the relations remain unchanged, even if this price, which begins in the conventional and traditional, is thereafter increasingly determined economically, first by the relation of the demand and supply, finally by the production cost at which the vendors themselves of these living services can be produced. Nothing is essentially changed thereby, because the determination of prices remains a merely formal moment for the exchange of mere use values as before. This determination itself, however, is created by other relations, by the general law and self-determination of the ruling mode of production, acting as it were behind the backs of this particular act of exchange. One of the forms in which this kind of pay first appears in the old communities is where an army is maintained. The pay of the common soldier is also reduced to a minimum, determined purely by the production cost necessary to procure him, but he exchanges the performance of his services not for capital, but for the revenue of the state. In bourgeois society itself, all exchange of personal services for work, including labor for personal consumption, cooking, sewing, etc., garden work, etc., up to including all the productive classes, civil servants, physicians, lawyers, scholars, etc., belong under this rubric within this category. All menial servants, etc., by means of their service, often coerced all these works, from the least to highest, obtain for themselves a share of the surplus product of the capitalist revenue. But it does not occur to anyone to think that by means of the exchange of his revenue for such services through private consumption, the capitalist posits himself as capitalist. Rather, he thereby spends the fruits of his capital. It does not change the nature of the relation that he proportions in which revenue is exchanged for its kind of living labor are themselves determined by the general laws of production. As we have already mentioned in the section on money, it is here rather the performer of the service who actually posits value, who transposes a use value, a certain kind of labor service, into value, money. Hence, in the Middle Ages, those who are oriented towards the production and accumulation of money proceed partly not from the side of the consuming land and nobility, but quite the opposite, from the side of living labor. They accumulate and thus become capitalist for a late period. The emancipated serfs become, in part, the capitalist. It thus does not depend on the general relation, but rather on the natural particular quality of the service performed, whether the recipient of payment receives it as a day wages, or as an honorarium, or as a sinecure, and whether he appears as superior or inferior in ranks to the person paying for the service. However, with the presupposition of capital as the dominant power, all these relations become more or less dishonored, but this does not belong here yet. This demystification of personal services, regardless of the lofty character with which tradition may have politically endowed them. It is not, then, simply the exchange of objectified labor for living labor, which appear from the standpoint as two different aspects, as use values in different forms, the one objective, the other subjective, which constitutes capital and hence wage labor, but rather the exchange of objectified labor as value, a self-sufficient value, for living labor as its use value not for a specific particular use of consumption, but its use value for value. In the exchange of money for labor or service, with the aim of direct consumption, a real exchange always takes place. The fact that amounts of labor are exchanged on both sides is of merely formal interest for measuring the particular forms of the utility of labor by comparing them with each other. This concerns only the form of the exchange, but does not form its content in the exchange of the capital for labor. Value is not a measure for the exchange of two use values, but is rather the content of the exchange itself. 2. In periods of the dissolution of pre-bourgeois relations, there sporadically occur free workers whose services are bought for the purposes not of consumption, but of production. But firstly, even if on a large scale, for the production only of direct use values, not of value, and secondly, if a nobleman brings the free worker together with his serfs, even if he resells a part of the worker's products, and the free worker thus creates value for him, then this Exchange takes place only for the superfluous product and only for the sake of the superfluity for luxury consumption. Is thus, at bottom, only a veiled purchase of alien labor for immediate consumption or as use value. Incidentally, wherever these free workers increase in numbers and wherever this relation grows, there the old mode of production, commune, patriarchal, feudal, etc., is in the process of dissolution, and the elements of real wage labor are in preparation. But the free servants can also emerge, as e.g. in Poland, and vanish again without a change in the mode of production taking place. In order to express the relations into which capital and wage labor enters property relations or laws, we need do no more than express the conduct of both sides in the realization process as an appropriation process. For example, the fact that surplus labor is posited as surplus value of capital means that the worker does not appropriate the product of his own labor, that it appears to him as alien property. Inversely, that alien labor appears as the property of law. This second law of bourgeois property, the inversion of the first, which through laws of inheritance attains an existence independent of the accidental transitoriness of individual capitalists, becomes just as established in law as the first. The first is the identity of labor with the property. The second, labor as negated property, or property as negation of the alien quality of alien labor. In fact, in the production process of capital, as will be seen more closely in its further development, labor is a totality, a combination of labors whose individual components, parts, are alien to one another, so that the overall process as a totality is not the work of the individual worker, and is furthermore the work of the different workers together, only to the extent that they are forcibly combined and do not voluntarily enter the combination with one another. The combination of this labor appears just as subservient to and led by an alien will and an alien intelligence, having its animating unity elsewhere, as its material unity appears subordinate to the objective unity of the machinery of fixed capital, which its animated monster objectifies the scientific idea and is in fact coordinator, does not in any way relate to the individual worker as his instrument, but rather he himself exists as an animated individual punctuation mark at its living isolated accessory. Thus, combined labor is combination in itself in a double way, not the combination as a mutual relationship among the individuals working together, nor as their predominance either over their particular or individual function, or over the instrument of labor. Hence, just as the worker relates to the product of his labor as an alien thing, so does he relate to the combination of labor as an alien combination as well to his own labor, as an expression of his life, which although it belongs to him, is alien to him and coerced from him, and which Adam Smith therefore conceives as burden, sacrifice, etc. Labor itself, like its product, is negated as the labor of the particular isolated worker. This isolated labor negated is now indeed communal or combined labor posited. The communal or combined labor posited in this way, as activity and in the passive objective form, is however at the same time posited in an other way towards the really existing individual labor, as an alien objectivity or alien property, as well as an alien subjectivity of capital. Capital thus represents both labor and its product as negated individualized labor, and hence as a negated property of the individualized worker. Capital, therefore, is the existence of social labor, the combination of labor as subject as well as object, but its existence as itself existing independently, opposite its real moments, hence itself a particular existence apart from them. For its part, capital therefore appears as the predominant subject and owner of alien labor, and its relation is itself as completely a contradiction as is that of wage labor. Alright, so what he's saying here is that the bourgeois economists typically regard capital as this eternal and natural form of production, but it had to emerge historically, and now whenever Marx says historical or history, just in general, he doesn't mean history as this like timeline of events, he means historical in kind of the way Hegel did. It was historically where it doesn't just happen, okay, it has to emerge out of something happening in the past. Like things happen for a reason, basically, okay? So, through violent transformations, that's later he would term so-called primitive accumulation, and once developed historically, capital itself creates the conditions of its existence. Formally, the relation has the equality and freedom of exchange as such. The worker, that is. This form is a mere semblance and a deceptive semblance. Workers are formally free, unlike slaves or serfs, but this freedom exists within conditions that compel wage dependence. Workers are free, but there is no such thing as abstract freedom. You're free to participate on the market. Coercion under capitalism only looks free because it is mediated economically rather than directly politically. Alienation doesn't exist psychologically. A product appears to it as a combination of alien material, alien instrument, and alien labor as alien property. Capital, therefore, is the existence of social labor, the combination of labor as subject as well as object, but its existence as itself existing independent opposition its real moments, hence itself a particular existence apart from them. For its part, capital therefore appears as the predominant subject and owner of alien labor, and its relation is itself a complete contradiction, as is that of wage labor. Now, what does that mean? So he's saying that labor exists as a subject. Labor subject takes the form of the living worker. That's the human being really building something. And then labor also takes the form as object. Okay, objectified labor, the tool of material the worker creates and uses. So your dead objectified labor is legally separated from your living subjective labor. It is no longer an extension of you at all, but an aggregate into a massive independent relation of capital. Pre-capitalist property and production. The original unity between a particular form of community or clan and the corresponding property in nature or relation to the objective conditions of production as a natural being, as an objective being of the individual, mediated by the commune. This unity, which appears in one respect as a particular form of property, has its living realities in a specific mode of production itself, a mode which appears as both a relation between the individuals and their specific active relation to the inorganic nature, a specific mode of working which is always family labor, often communal labor. The community itself appears as the first great force of production. Particular kinds of production conditions, such as stock breeding and agriculture, develop particular modes of production, and the particular forces of production, subjective, appearing as a qualities of individuals as well as objective ones. In the last analysis, their community, as well as the property based on it, resolves itself into a specific state, the development of productive forces of working subjects, to which correspond their specific relations amongst one another and towards nature. Until a certain point, reproduction then turns into dissolution. Property, then, originally means in its Asiatic, Slavonic, ancient classical, Germanic form, the relation of the working, producing or self-producing subject to the conditions of his production or reproduction as his own. It will therefore have different forms dependent on the conditions of this production. Production itself aims at the reproduction of the producer within and together with these, as objective conditions of existence. This relation as proprietor, not as a result, but as a presupposition of labor, such as of production, presupposes the individual defined as a member of a clan or community whose property the individual himself is up to a certain point. Slavery, bondage, etc., where the worker himself appears among the natural conditions of production for a third individual or community. This is not the case with the general slavery of the Orient only from the European point of view. Property, no longer the relation of the working individual to the objective conditions of labor, is always secondary, derived neither original, although it is a necessary and logical result of property, founded on the community and labor in the community. It is of course very simple to imagine that some powerful, physically dominant individual, after first having caught the animal, then catches humans in order to have them catch animals. In a word, uses human beings as another naturally occurring condition for his reproduction, whereas his own labor reduces itself to ruling like any of the other natural creatures. But such a notion is stupid. Correct as it may be from the standpoint of some particular given clan or commune, because it proceeds from the development of isolated individuals. But human beings become individuals only through the process of history. He appears originally as a species being through the process of history. He appears originally as a species being, clan being, herd animal, although in no way whatever as a political animal. In the political sense, exchange itself is the chief means of this individuation. It makes the herd-like existence superfluous and dissolves it. Soon the matter is turned in such a way that the individual he relates to only to himself, with the means with which he posits himself as individuals, have become the making of this generality and commonness in this community. The objective being of the individual as proprietor, say proprietor of land, is presupposed and presupposed moreover under certain conditions which chain him to the community, or rather form a link in his chain. In bourgeois society, the worker stands there purely without objective subjectivity, but the thing which stands opposite him has now become the true community, or Gemeinwesen, which is an important word if you listen to my book on Kamat, which he tries to make the meal of, and which makes him a meal of him. All forms, more or less naturally arisen, spontaneous, all at the same time, however, result of a historic process, in which the community presupposes its subjects in a specific objective unity with their conditions, or production in which a specific subjective mode of being presupposes the communities themselves. As conditions of production necessarily correspond to a development of the forces of production, which is only limited and indeed limited in principle, the development of the forces of production dissolve these forms, and their dissolution is itself a development of the human productive forces. Labor begins with a certain foundation, naturally arisen, spontaneous at first, then historic presupposition. Then, however, this foundation or presupposition is itself suspended or posited as a vanishing presupposition, which has become too confining for the unfolding of the progressing human pack. Insofar as classical landed property reappears in modern small parcel land ownership, it itself belongs to political economy, and we shall come to it in the section on landed property. All of this is to be returned to at greater depth and length. What we are here concerned with is this: the relation of labor to capital, or to the objective conditions of labor as capital, presupposes a process of history which dissolves the various forms in which the worker is a proprietor, or in which the proprietor works. Thus, above all, 1. Dissolution of the relation of earth, land, and soil as natural conditions of production, to which he releases as his own inorganic beings. The workshop has forces in the domain his will. All forms in which this property appears presupposes a community whose members, although there may be formal distinction between them, are, as members of it, proprietors. The original form of this property is therefore itself direct common property. The Oriental form, modified in the Slavonic, developed to the point of antithesis, but still as the secret, if antithetical, foundation in classical and Germanic property. 2. Dissolution of the relations in which he appears as proprietor of the instrument. Just as the above form of landed property presupposes a real community, so does this property of the workers in the instrument presuppose a particular form of the development of manufacturers. Namely, craft, artisan work, bound up with it the guild corporation system, and etc. The manufacture system of the ancient Orient can be examined under one already. Here, labor itself still half artistic, half in and itself, such as mastering, capitalist himself, still master journeyman, attain of particular skill in the work also secures the possession of instruments, etc., etc. Just so you know, this is not written. If what I'm saying seems weird, as far as I'm aware, the original text is reproduced as it's written, and this is just his notes, so it's not exactly well written. You know, like he says etc., i.e. I've just been skipping over it, like unnecessarily. I don't know what that's about. Inheritability, then, to a certain extent of the mode of work together with the organization of work and the instrument of work. Medieval cities, labor, still has its own definite self-sufficient development of one-sided abilities. 3. Included in both is the fact that he has the means of consumption in his possession before production, which are necessary for him to live as producer, such as during production before its completion. As proprietor of land, he appears as directly provided with the necessary consumption fund. As master in a craft, he has inherited it, earned it, saved it up, in his young years, first as an apprentice, where he does not appear as an actual independent worker at all, but shares the master's fare in a patriarchal way. As journeyman, a genuine one, there's a certain communality in the consumption fund possessed by the master, while it is not the journeyman's property, either still, through laws of the guild, tradition, etc., at least co-possession, etc., to be gone into further. 4. Dissolution. Likewise, at the same time of the relation in which the workers themselves, the living labor capacities themselves, still belong directly among the objective conditions of production, they are appropriate as such as slaves or serfs. For capital, the worker is not a condition of production, only work is. If he can make machines do it, or even water, air, and so much the better. It does not appropriate the worker, but is labor, not directly, but mediated through exchange. There are now, on one side, historic presuppositions needed before the worker can be found as a free worker, as objectless, purely subjective labor capacity, confronting the objective conditions of production as not his property, as alien property, as value for itself, as capital. But the question arises, on the other side, which conditions are required so that he finds himself up against the capital? The formula of capital, where living labor releases to the raw material, as well as to the instrument and the means of subsistence required during labor, as negatives, as not property, includes, first of all, not land ownership, or the negation of the situation in which the working individual relates to land and soil, to the earth as his own, in which he works, produces as proprietor of all land and soil. In the best case, he relates not only as worker to the land and soil, but also as proprietor of the land and soil to himself as working subject. Ownership of land and soil potentially also includes ownership of raw material, as well as the primordial instrument, the earth itself, and of its spontaneous fruits. Posited in the most original form, it means relating to the earth as proprietor and finding raw material and instruments on hand, as well as the necessities of a life created not by labor, but by the earth itself. Once this relation is reproduced, secondary instruments and fruits of the earth, created through labor itself, appear as included with landed property in its primitive form. This historic situation is thus, first of all, negated as a full property relation in the worker's relation to the conditions of labor as capital. This is historic state number 1, in which negated in his relation or presupposed as historically dissolved. Secondly, however, where there is ownership of the instrument on the part of the worker relates to the instrument as his own, where the worker works as owner of the instrument, which at the same time presupposes the subsumption of the instrument under his individual work, such as a particular limited development stage of the productive force of labor. Where this form of the worker's owner, or the working owner, is already posited as an independent form besides and apart from landed property, the artisan-like and urban development of labor, not as in the first case, as accidental to landed property and subsumed under it. Hence, where the raw material and the necessaries of life are also mediated as the craftsman's property, mediated through his craftwork, through his property in the instrument, there are second historical stage in which presupposed beside and apart from the first, which must itself already appear significantly modified through the achievement of independence by the second sort of property or by working owners. Since the instrument itself is already the product of labor, thus the element which constitutes property already exists as posited by labor, the community can no longer appear here in a naturally arisen, spontaneous form as in the first case. The community on which this form of property is founded, but rather as itself already a produced, made, derived, and secondary community produced by the worker himself. It is clear that wherever ownership of the instrument is a relation to the conditions of production as property, there in the real labor process, the instrument appears only as a means of individual labor. The art of really appropriating the instrument, of handling it as an instrument of labor, appears as the worker's particular skill, which posits him as the owner of the instrument. In short, the essential character of the guild corporation system, of craftwork as its subject, constituted by owners, can be resolved into the relation to the instrument of production. The owner of labor as property, as distinct from the relation to the earth, to land and soil, to the raw material as such, as one's own, that the relation to this one moment of the condition of production constitute the working subject as owner, makes him into a working owner. This is historic situation number 2, which by its nature can exist only as antithesis to, or if one will, at the same time, as complement of a modified form of the first. Likewise, negating the first formula of capital, the third possible form, in which the worker relates as owner only to the necessaries of life, finding them on hand as the natural condition of the working subject, without relating to the land and soil, or to the instrument, or even therefore to labor itself as its own, is at the bottom the formula of slavery and bondage, which is likewise negated and posited as a production as capital. The original form of property necessarily dissolved into the relation to the different objective moments which condition production as one's own. They form the economic foundations of different forms of community, just as their part, has specific forms of the community as presupposition. These forms are essentially modified by the inclusion of labor itself among objective conditions of production, like serfdom and slavery, through which the simply affirmative character of all forms of property include number 1 is lost and modified. They all contain within themselves slavery as possible and hence as their own suspension. As regards number 2, where the particular kind of work, mastery of it, and consequent upon that an identity between property in the instrument and property in the conditions of production, while it excludes slavery and bondage, can take on an analogous negative development in the form of the caste system. The third form, ownership of the necessaries of life, if it does not reduce itself to slavery and serfdom, cannot contain a relation by the working individual to the conditions of production and hence of existence. It can therefore only be the relation of a member of the original community based on land ownership who has lost his landed property and not yet proceeded to various number 2 of property, such as the Roman plebes at the time of the breads and circuses. The relation of personal servitude, or of the retainers of their lord, is essentially different, for it is formed at the bottom only a mode of existence of the landed proprietor himself, who no longer works, but whose property includes among the other conditions of production the workers themselves as bondsmen. Here, the master-servant relation as essential elements of the appropriation, basically the appropriation of animals, land, etc., cannot take place in the master-servant relation. Although the animal provides services, the presupposition of the master-servant relation is the appropriation of an alien will. Whatever has no will, the animal may provide a service, but does not thereby make its owner into a master. This much can be seen here, however, that the master-servant relation likewise belongs in this formulation of the appropriation of the instruments of production, and it forms a necessary ferment on the development and the decline and fall of the original relations of property and of production, just as it expresses their limited nature. Still, it is reproduced in the mediated form in capital, and thus likewise forms a ferment in its dissolution and an emblem of its limitation. On one side, historic processes are presupposed which place a mass of individuals in a nation in the position, if not at first of real free workers, nevertheless at such as who are so, Greek word, whose only property is their labor capacity and the possibility of exchanging it for values, then present individuals who confront all objective conditions of production as alien property, as their own non-property, but at the same time as values, as exchangeable, hence appropriable to a certain degree through living labor. Such historic processes of dissolution are also the dissolution of the bondage relations which fetter the workers to land and soil and the landlord of land and soil, but which factually presuppose his ownership of the necessaries of life. This is, in truth, the process of this release from earth. Dissolution of the landed property relations, which constitute him as a yeoman, as a free working small landowner, or tenant, a free peasant. Dissolution of the guild relations, which presupposes ownership of the instrument of labor, and which presuppose labor itself as a craftsman-like, specific skill as property, not merely as the sole source of property. Likewise, dissolution of the client relations in the various forms in which non-proprietors appear in the retinue of their lord as co-consumers of the surplus product, and wear the livery of their master as an equivalent participant in his feuds, performs personal services, imaginary or real. It will be seen on closer inspection that all these processes of dissolution mean the dissolution of relations of production in which use value predominates production for direct consumption, in which exchange value in its production presupposes the predominance of one or the other form. And hence that in all these relations, payment in kind and services in kind predominate over payment in money services. But this only by the way. Okay, I don't know what that sentence means. It will be likewise be found on closer observation that all dissolved relations were possible only with a definite degree of development of the material and hence also the intellectual forces of production. What concerns us here for the moment is this: the process of dissolution, which transforms the massive individuals of a nation into free wage laborers, individuals forced solely by their lack of property to sell their labor. I assume this word translates to proletariat. So, maybe I'll just say that. The free wage laborers, proletariat individuals, forced solely by their lack of property to sell their labor, presupposes on the other side not that these individuals' previous sources of income and in part conditions of property have disappeared, but the reverse. That only their utilization has become different, that their mode of existence has changed, has gone into the other hands as a free hand, or even in part remained in the same hands. But this much is clear. The same process which divorced a mass of individuals from their previous relations to the objective conditions of labor, relations by which were, in one way or the other, affirmative, negated these relations, and thereby transformed these individuals into free workers. The same process freed proletarian, these objective conditions of labor, land and soil, raw material, necessaries of life, instruments of labor, money, or all these, form from their previous states of attachment to the individuals now separates from them. They are still there on hand, but in another form, as a free fund, in which all political relations are obliterated. The objective conditions of labor now confront these unbound propertyless individuals only in the form of values, self-sufficient values. The same process which placed the mass face-to-face with the objective conditions of labor, as free workers, also placed these conditions as capital face-to-face with the free workers. The historical process was the divorce of elements which up until then were bound together. Its result is therefore not that one of the elements disappear, but that each of them appears in a negative relation to the other. The potentially free worker on the one side, capital potentially on the other. The separation of the objective conditions from the classes which becomes transformed into free workers necessarily also appears at the same time as the achievement of independence by the same conditions at the opposite pole. If the relation of capital and wage labor is regarded not as already commanding and predominant over the whole of production, but as arising historically, such as if we regard the original transformation of money into capital, the process of exchange between capital, still only existing proletarian on one side, and the free worker existing... That word doesn't mean that. I don't know what this word means at all. I'm lost. On the other. Then, of course, one cannot help making the simple observation, out of which the economists make a great show, that the side which appears as capital has to possess raw materials, instruments of labor, and necessaries of life, so the worker can live during the production before production is completed. Apparently it means power. I guess. It doesn't seem to make sense, but it apparently translates to power. So I'm gonna read it as that. Anyways, I'm going to read the last paragraph. If the relation of capital and wage labor is regarded not as already commanding and predominant over the whole production, but as arising historically, such as if we regard the original transformation of money into capital and process of exchange between capital, still only existing power on one side and the free worker existing power on the other, then of course one cannot help making the simple observation, out of the economists make a great show, that the side which appears as capital has to possess raw materials, instruments of labor, and necessaries of life. so that the worker can live during the production before production is completed. This further takes the form that there must have taken place on the part of the capitalist an accumulation prior to labor and not sprung out of it, which enables him to put the worker to work and to maintain his effectiveness, to maintain him his living labor capacity. This act by capital, which is independent of labor, not posited by labor, is then shifted from the prehistory of capital into the present, into a moment of its reality and of its present activity, of its self-formation. From this is ultimately derived the eternal right of capital to the fruits of labor, or rather its mode of appropriation is developed out of the simple and just laws of equivalent exchange. Wealth present in the form of money can be exchanged from the objective conditions of labor only because and if these are separate from labor itself. We saw that money can be piled up in part by way of the sheer exchange of equivalents, but this form is so insignificant a source that it's not worth mentioning historically. If it is, it presupposes that this money, which is gained through exchange of one's own labor. The monetary wealth, which becomes transformed into capital in the proper sense into industrial capital, is rather the mobile wealth piled up through usury, especially that practices out against landed property, and through mercantile profits. We shall have occasion below to speak further of both of these forms, insofar as they appear not as themselves forms of capital, but as earlier forms of wealth as the presuppositions for capital. It is inherent in the concept of capital, as we have seen in its origin, that it begins with money, and hence with the wealth existing in the form of money. It is likewise inherent in it that it appears as coming out of circulation as the product of circulation. The formation of capital thus does not emerge from landed property, there are at the most from the tenant, insofar as he is the dealer in agricultural products, or from the guild, although there is a possibility at the last point, but rather from the merchant's and usurer's wealth. But the latter encountered the conditions where free labor can be purchased only when this labor has been released from its objective conditions of existence through the process of history. Only then does it also encounter the possibility of buying these conditions themselves. Under guild conditions, like mere money, if it is not itself guild money, master's money cannot buy the looms to make people work with them. How many of these individuals may operate is prescribed. In short, the instrument itself is still so intertwined with living labor, whose domain appears that it does not truly circulate. What enables money wealth to become capital is the encounter on one side with free workers, and on the other side with the necessaries and material, which previously were in one way or the other the property of the masses, who have now become objectless and are also free from purchase and purchasable. The other condition of labor, however, a certain level of skill, instrument as means of labor, is already available to it in the preliminary, or first period of capital, partly as a result of the urban guild system, partly as a result of the domestic industrial or industrial, which is attached to agriculture as an accessory. This historic process is not the product of capital, but the presupposition of it, and it is through the process that the capitalist inserts himself as a historic middleman between landed property, or property generally, and labor. History knows nothing of the congenital fantasies according to which capitalists and workers form an association, nor is there a trace of them in the conceptual development of capital. Manufacturers may develop sporadically, locally in the framework, which still belongs to a quite different period, as in the Italian cities alongside the guilds, but it's the sole predominant forms of an epoch, the conditions for capital to have developed not only locally, but on a grand scale. Notwithstanding this, individual guild masters may develop into capitalists with the distortions of the guild, but the case is rare in the nature of things as well. As a rule, the whole guild system declines and falls, both master and journeyman, where the capitalist and worker arise. It goes without saying, and shows itself if we go more deeply into historic epoch under discussion here, that in truth, the period of the dissolution of the earlier modes of production in the modes of the worker's relation to the objective conditions of labor is at the same time a period in which money wealth on the one side has already developed to a certain extent, and the other side grows and expands rapidly through the same circumstances as accelerate the above dissolution. It is itself one of the agencies that dissolution, while at the same time that dissolution is a condition of its transformation into capital, but the mere presence of monetary wealth and even the achievement of a kind of supremacy on this part is in no way sufficient for this dissolution into capital to happen. Or else, ancient Rome, Byzantium, etc. would have ended their history with free labor and capital, or rather begun a new history. There too, dissolution of old property relations was bound up with the development of monetary wealth or trade. But instead of leading into the industry, this dissolution led in fact to the supremacy of the countryside over the city. The original formation of capital does not happen, as is sometimes imagined, with capital heaping up necessaries of life and instruments of labor and raw materials. In short, the objective conditions of labor, which have already been unbound from the soil and animated by human labor. Capital does not create the objective conditions of labor. Rather, its original formation is that through the historical process of the dissolution of the old mode of production, value existing as monetary wealth is enabled on one side to buy the objective conditions of labor, on the other side to exchange money for living labor of the workers who have been set free. At this moment, or present, the divorce is itself a historical process, a process of dissolution, and is the latter which enables money to transform itself into capital. Money itself, to the extent that it does not also plays an active role, does so only insofar as it intervenes in this process as a highly energetic solvent, and to the extent assists in the creation of the plucked, objectless free workers. But certainly not by creating the objective conditions of their existence, rather by helping to speed up their separation from them, their propertylessness. Britain, e.g., the great English landowners dismissed the retainers, who had together with them consumed the surplus product of the land, when further their tenants chased off the small cottages. Then, firstly, a mass of living labor powers was thereby thrown onto the labor market. A mass which was free in a double sense, free from the old relations of clientship, bondage, and servitude, and secondly, free of all belonging and possessions and of every objective material form of being free of all property, dependent on the scale of its labor capacity, or on begging, vagabondage, and robbery as its only source of income. It is a matter of historical record that they tried the latter first, but were driven off this road by gallows, stocks, and whippings, on to the narrow path of the labor market. Owing to this fact, the governments of Henry VII, VIII, etc. appear as conditions of the historical dissolution process and as makers of the conditions for the existence of capital. On the other side, the necessaries of life, which the landowners previously ate up together with their retainers, now stood at the disposal of any money which might wish to buy them in order to buy labor, through their instrumentality. Money neither created nor stockpiled these necessaries. They were there and were consumed and reproduced before they were consumed and reproduced through its mediation. What changed was simply this, that these necessaries were now thrown on to the exchange market, were separated from their direct connection with the mouths of the retainers, and transformed from use values into exchange values, and thus fell into the domain and under the supremacy of money wealth. Likewise, with the instruments of labor, money wealth neither invented nor fabricated the spinning wheel and the loom, but once unbound from their land and soil, spinner and weaver with their tools and wheels came under the command of money wealth. Capital proper does nothing but bring together the mass of hands and instruments with it finds on hand. It agglomerates them under its command. That its real stockpiling, the stockpiling workers along with their instruments at particular points. This will have to be dealt with more closely in the so-called stockpiling of capital. Monetary wealth, as merchant wealth, had admittedly helped to speed up or dissolve the old relations of production and made it possible for the proprietor of land, for example, as Adam Smith already nicely develops, to exchange his grain and cattle for use values brought from afar. Instead of squandering the use values he himself produced along with his retainer, and to locate his wealth in great part in the mass of his co-consuming retainers, because the exchange value is his revenue a higher significance for him. The same thing took place in regards to his tenants, who were already semi-capitalists, but still very hemmed-in ones. The development of exchange value, favored by money existing in form of the merchant estate, dissolves production, which is more oriented towards direct use value and its corresponding forms of property. The relation of labor and its objective conditions, and thus pushes forward towards the making of the labor market, certainly to be distinguished from slave markets. However, even this action of money is only possible given the presupposition of an urban artisan resting not on capital, but on the organization of labor in guilds. Urban labor itself has created means of production for which the guilds became just as confining, or as were the old relations of land ownership, to an improved agriculture, which was in part itself a consequence of the larger market for agriculture projects in the cities. The other circumstances, which in the 16th century increased the mass of circulating commodities as well as that of money, which created new needs and thereby raised the exchange value of indigenous products, raised prices, all of these promoted on one side the dissolution of the old relations of production, sped up the separation of the worker or non-worker, but able-bodied individual from the objective conditions of his reproduction, and thus promoted the transformation of money into capital. There can therefore be nothing more ridiculous than to conceive this original formation of capital as if capital had stockpiled and created objective conditions of production, necessaries, raw materials, instruments, and then offered them to the workers who was bearer of these possessions. Rather, monetary wealth in part helped to strip the labor prowess of able-bodied individuals from these conditions, and in part this process of divorce proceeded without it. When these formation of capital had reached a certain level, monetary wealth could place itself as mediator between the objective conditions of life. Thus, liberated in the liberated, but also homeless and empty-handed labor powers imbibe the latter with the former. But now, as far as the formation of money wealth itself is concerned, this belongs to the prehistory of the bourgeois economy. Usury, trade, urbanization, and the treasury rising with its play the main roles here. So too, hoarding by tenants, peasants, etc., although to a lesser degree. This shows at the same time that the development of exchange and of exchange value, which is everywhere mediated through trade and whose mediation may be termed trade, money achieves an independent existence in the merchant estate, as the circulation in trade brings with it the dissolution of labor's relations of property and its conditions of existence, in one respect. At the same time, the dissolution of labor, which is itself classed as one of the objective conditions of production. All these are relations which express a predominance of use value and of production directed towards use value, as well as the real community, which is itself still directly present as a presupposition of production. Production based on exchange value and the community based on the exchange of these exchange values, even though they seem, as we saw in the previous chapter on money, to posit property as the outcome of labor alone, and to posit private property over the production of one's own labor as condition, and labor as general condition of wealth, all presuppose and produce the separation of labor from its objective conditions. This exchange of equivalents proceeds. It is only the surface layer of a production which rests on the appropriation of alien labor without exchange, but with the semblance of exchange. This system of exchange rests on capital as its foundation when it is regarded in isolation from capital, as it appears on the surface as an independent system. Then it is a mere illusion, but a necessary illusion. Thus, there is no longer any ground for astonishment that the system of exchange values, exchange of equivalents, measured through labor, turns into, or rather reveals as its hidden background, the appropriation of alien labor without exchange. Completely separation of labor and property from the domination of exchange value itself, and of exchange value producing production, presupposes alien labor capacity itself as an exchange value, such as the separation of living labor capacity from its objective condition. A relation to them, or its own objectivity as alien property, a relation to them, in a word, as capital. Only in the period of decline and fall of the feudal system, but where it still struggles internally, as in England in the 14th and the first half of the 15th century, is there a golden age for labor in the process of becoming emancipated in order for labor to relate to its objective conditions as its property again. Another system must take place of the system of private exchange, which, as we saw, posits the exchange of objectified labor for labor capacity, and therefore the appropriation of living labor without exchange. The way in which money transforms itself into capital often shows itself quite tangible in history. When the merchant induces a number of weavers and spinners who until then wove and spun as a rural secondary occupation to work for him, making their secondary into their chief occupation, but then has them in his power and has brought them under his command as wage laborers, to draw them away from their hometowns and to concentrate them in the place of work is a further step. In this simple process, it is clear that the capitalist has prepared neither the raw materials, nor the instrument, nor the means of subsistence for the weaver and the spinner. All that he had done is to restrict them little by little to one kind of work in which they become dependent on selling on the buyer, the merchant, the ultimate product only for and through him. He bought the labor originally only by buying their product as soon as they restrict themselves to the production of this exchange value and thus must directly produce exchange values, must exchange their labor entirely for money in order to survive, and then come under this command, and even the illusion that they sold him products disappears. He buys their labor and takes their property first in the form of the product, and as soon as the instrument as well, or he leaves it to them as sham property in order to reduce his own production costs. The original historic forms in which capital appears at first sporadically or locally alongside the old modes of production, while exploding them little by little elsewhere, everywhere, is on one side manufacture proper, not yet factory. This springs up where mass quantities are produced for export for the external market, i.e. on the basis of large-scale overland and maritime commerce, in the emporiums like the Italian cities or the Soviet Union, Constantinople, and the Flemish, Dutch cities, a few Spanish ones such as Barcelona. Manufacture seizes hold initially, not of so-called urban trades, but of the rural secondary occupations, spinning and weaving, the two which at least require guiding level skills, technical training. Apart from the Greece great emporiums, where the external market is its basis, where production is thus, so to speak, naturally oriented towards exchange value, manufacturers derive connected with shipbuilding itself, etc. It takes its first residence not in the cities, but on land, in villages lacking guilds, etc. The rural subsidiarity occupations have the broad basis or characteristic of manufacturers, while the urban trade demands the great progress in production before they can be conducted in factory style. Likewise, certain branches of production, such as glassworks, metalworks, sawmills, which demand a higher concentration of labor power from the outset, apply more natural energy from the outset, demand mass production. Likewise, concentration of the means of labor, etc. Likewise, paper mills. It's not very clearly. On the one side, the rise of the tenant and the transformation of agricultural population and the free day laborers. Although this transformation in the countryside is the last to push on towards its ultimate consequences in its purest form, its beginnings there are almost the earliest. Classical antiquity, which could never get beyond the urban or the Senate proper, could therefore never get to the large industry. The first presupposition of the latter is to draw the land in all its expanse into the production not of use values, but of exchange values. Glass factories, paper mills, ironworks, etc. cannot be operated on guild principles. They demand mass production, sales to a general market, monetary wealth on the part of the entrepreneur. Not that he creates the conditions, neither the subjective nor objective ones, but under the old relations of property and of production, these conditions cannot be brought together. The dissolution of relations of serfdom, like the rise of manufacture, then little by little transform all branches of work into branches operated by capital. The cities themselves, it is true, also contain an element of the formation of wage labor proper in the non-guild day laborers, unskilled laborers, etc. While, as we have seen, the transformation of money into capital presupposes a historic process which divorces the objective conditions of labor from the worker and makes them independent of them, it is at the same time the effect of capital and of its process once arisen to conquer all of production and to develop and complete the divorce between labor and property, between labor and the objective conditions of labor everywhere. It will then be seen, in the course of further development, the capital destroys craft and artisan labor while working small land ownership together with itself in the forms in which it does not appear in opposition to labor. Its small capital, and in the intermediate species, the species between old modes of production, or in their renewal as the foundation of capital in the classical adequate mode of production of capital itself. The only stockpiling presupposes at the origin of capital is that of monetary wealth, which is regarded in and for itself is altogether unproductive, as it only springs up out of circulation and belongs exclusively to it. Capital rapidly forms an internal market for itself by destroying all rural secondary occupations, so that it spins, weaves for everyone, clothes for everyone, etc. In short, brings the commodities previously created as direct use values into the form of exchange value, a process which comes about by itself through the separation of the worker from the land in the soil and from property, even in the form of serf property and the conditions of production. With the urban crafts, although they rest entirely on exchange and on the creation of exchange values, the direct and chief aim of this production is subsistence as craftsmen, as master journeymen, hence use value, not wealth, not exchange value as exchange value. Production is therefore always subordinated to given consumption, supply to demand, and expands only solely. The production of capitalist and wage laborers is thus a chief product of capital's realization process. Ordinary economics, which look only at the things produced, forgets this completely, when objectified labor is in this process at the same time, posted as the worker's non-objectivity, as the objectivity of a subjectivity antithetical to the worker, as property of a will alien to him, then capital is necessarily at the same time the capitalist, and the idea held by some socialists that we need capital but not the capitalist is altogether wrong. That's a good line. It is posited within the concept of capital that the objective conditions of labor, that they are its own product, take on personality towards it, or what is the same, that these are posited as the property of a personality alien to the worker. The concept of capital contains the capitalist. Okay, so I had a little bit of trouble with this one. So what he's saying here, mostly just because it's the Greek words not being translated, so it means power. This is like I said before. Property is the relation of the working subject to the conditions of his production or reproduction as his own, and property form depends on historically specific modes of production. So distinctly different paths of the origin of property exist in different societies. He lists, different ones in I think Asia, Oceania, stuff like that. So there are different paths of the origin of property, and this indicates that there's a multi-linear direction to human economic development. Engels talked about this more in those Russian letters. Community itself is a social relation, appearing as the first great force of production. Particular conditions develop particular forces of production, which appear as qualities of individuals, so it's not just that material reality is what determines the world, but people are part of that material reality. Human beings become individuals only through the process of history. Human beings are not originally isolated social units, but only become that way through the process of history. I just repeating myself. Anyways, individuals are made out of society. The individuality is not this natural baseline, but an artifact constructed by historical mechanisms. Exchange itself is a chief means of this individualization. Capitalism comes about when the historic process divorces elements which up until then were bound together, and its result is not that one of the elements disappears, but that each of them appears in a negative related to the other. Capitalism is fundamentally built on a structurally adversarial separation that requires the continuous state enforcement to prevent workers from reconnecting with their means of subsistence. The presupposition of the master-servant relation is the appropriation of an alien will, which is reproduced in mediated form in capital. Capital captures the human will itself, and this is where desire comes from. The role of the state is to force people into the labor market, and as capital does not rely purely on market mechanics, there is a continuous presence of state violence to discipline the population and keep them alienated from their means of survival. Important quote, the system of exchange rests on capital as its foundation, and when it is regarded in isolation from capital, it appears on the surface as an independent system. Then it is a mere illusion, but a necessary illusion. You cannot, so this is response to market socialists like Jacob and Mag, you cannot utilize market mechanics or reform the sphere of exchange to achieve liberation, because the market itself is built upon the foundation of exploitation. When objectified labor is posited as the worker's non-objectivity, as a property of a will alien to him, then capital is necessarily, at the same time, the capitalist, and the idea held by some socialists that we need capital but not capitalists is altogether wrong. I think that's also a quote. He says that almost verbatim there. Like, that's just, the Soviet Union. The domination of exchange value itself presupposes alien labor capacity as an exchange value, which is to say that the workers come to view their own creative capacity as an alien property, and capital is a system that fractures human subjectivity itself. Population, overpopulation, and Malthus. This is relevant. Malthus' theory, which incidentally was not his invention, but whose fame he appropriated through the clerical fanaticism with which he propounded it, actually only through the weight he placed on it, is significant in two respects. One, because he gives brutal expression to the brilliant viewpoint of capital. Two, because he asserted the fact of overpopulation in all forms of society, he has not. For there's nothing more uncritical than this motley compilation from historians and travelers' descriptions. His conception is altogether false and childish. One, because he regards overpopulation as being of the same kind in all the different historic phases of economic development, does not understand their specific differences, and hence stupidly deduces these very complicated and varying relations to a single relation. Two, equations in which the natural reproduction of humanity appears on the one side and the natural reproduction of edible plants or means of subsistence on the other as two natural series, the former geometric and the latter arithmetic in progression. In this way, he transforms the historically distinct relations into abstract numerical relations, which he has fished purely out of thin air and which rest neither on natural nor on historical laws. There is allegedly a natural difference between the reproduction of humankind and grain. This baboon thereby implies that the increase of humanity is a purely natural process, which requires external restraints, checks to prevent it from proceeding in geometric progression. This geometric reproduction is the natural reproduction process of mankind. He would find in history that population proceeds in very different relations, and that overproduction is likewise a historically determined relation, in no way determined by abstract numbers or by the absolute limit of the productivity of the necessaries of life, but by the limits posited rather by specific conditions of production. As well as restricted numerically, how small do the numbers, which mean overpopulation for the Athenians, appear to us? Secondly, restricted according to character. An overpopulation of free Athenians would become transformed into colonists is significantly different from an overpopulation of workers who become transformed into workhouse inmates. Similarly, the begging overpopulation, which consumed the surplus produce of a monastery, is different from that which is a factory. It is Malthus who abstracts from these specific historical laws of the movement of population, which are indeed the history of the nature of humanity, the natural laws. But natural laws of humanity only at a specific historic development, with a development of the forces of production, determined by humanity's own process of history. Malthusian man, abstracted from historically determined man, exists only in his brain. Hence also the geometric method of reproduction corresponding to this natural Malthusian man. Real history thus appeared to him in such a way that the reproduction of his natural humanity is not an abstraction from the historical process of real reproduction, but just the contrary. The real reproduction is an application of the Malthusian theory. Hence, the inherent conditions of population, as well as overpopulation, at every stage of history, appears to him as a series of external checks which has prevented the population from developing in the Malthusian form. The conditions in which mankind historically produces and reproduces itself appear as barriers to reproduction of the Malthusian natural man, who is a Malthusian creature. On the other hand, the production of necessities of life, as it is checked, determined by the human action, appear as a check which it posits to itself. The ferns would cover the entire earth. The reproduction would stop only where space for them ceased. They would obey no arithmetic proportion. It is hard to say where Malthus has discovered that the reproduction of voluntary natural products would stop for intrinsic reasons, without external checks. He transformed the imminent historically changing limits of human reproduction process into the outer barriers, and outer barriers into natural reproduction into imminent limits of natural laws of reproduction. 2. He stupidly relates a specific quantity of people to a specific quantity of necessities. Ricardo immediately incorrectly confronted him with the fact that the quantity of grain available is completely irrelevant to the worker if he has no employment. That is, it is therefore the means of employment, and not a subsistence, which put him in the category of surplus populations. But this should be conceived more generally, and relates to the social mediation as such, through which individual gains access to the means of reproduction and creates them. Hence, it relates to the conditions of production and his relation to them. There was no barrier to the reproduction of Athenian slaves other than the producible necessaries, and we never hear that there were surplus slaves in antiquity. The call for them increased rather. There was, however, a surplus population of non-workers in the immediate sense, who were not too many in relation to the necessaries available, but who lost the conditions under which they could appropriate them. The invention of surplus labor, i.e. of propertyless people who work belonging to a period of capital. The beginning beggars who fasten themselves to the monasteries and help them eat up their surplus products are in the same class as the feudal retainers, and this shows that the surplus produce could not be eaten up by the small number of its owners. It is only another form of retainers of old, of which the menial servants of today. The overpopulation among hunting peoples, which shows itself in the warfare between tribes, proves not that the earth could not support their small numbers, but rather that the conditions of their reproduction require a great amount of territory or for few people. Neither relation to a non-existent absolute mass of means of subsistence, but rather relation to the conditions of reproduction of the production of these means, including likewise the conditions of reproduction of human beings, or the total population of relatively surplus populations. This surplus, purely relatively, in no way relates to the means of subsistence as such, but rather to the mode of producing them. Hence, also only a surplus at this stage of development. Yeah, so this is kind of relevant now with, like, climate stuff and whatever. So, there are many arguments today over human carrying capacity, and they blame the issue on the number of humans, when the issue is more directly in regards to resource production and allocation that is done by these people. But people is not, like, they're making the exact same mistake of just normal nationalists. They're saying the nation, now they're saying the people of the world. Okay, but the people of the world do many different things. There's a different class relationship of the people of the world. They have incongruent levels of power and influence over one another. And when you look at that, you see that it's not just some sort of moral failure of humanity in general at all. Okay? But power and difference. So when whether a population is too big or not depends entirely on how society is organized to produce and distribute the resources of said population. Poverty will never be solved through better distribution or welfare, as the quantity of grain available is completely irrelevant to the worker if he has no employment. That's said by Ricardo, by the way. That was crazy. Mathematically mapping out human reproduction is a silly idea, as population dynamics are bound by historical produced laws, not biological laws. The guy who coined the word ecosystem, that was actually his goal with that, was to map humans mathematically. He's just a neo-Malthusian. Like, Marx already refutes this all the way back in 1850. Every economic system produces its own specific surplus population. The modern proletariat poverty is tied directly to the wage labor system, because, like, you wouldn't say, you know, during slavery, you had an overpopulation of slaves. Like, no one would say that. So obviously, overpopulation isn't this, like, neutral delineation at all, you know. Capitalism, machinery, and automation. As long as the means of labor remains a means of labor in the proper sense of this term, such as it is historically adopted by capital and included in its realization process, it undergoes a merely formal modification by appearing now as a means of labor, not in regards to its material side, but at the same time as a particular mode of presence of capital determination by its total process as fixed capital. But once adopted into the production process of capital, the means of labor passes through different metamorphoses, whose culmination is the machine, or rather an automatic system of machinery. The automatic one, is merely its most complete, most adequate form, and alone transforms machinery into a system, set in motion by an automaton, a moving power that moves itself. This automaton consists of numerous mechanical and intellectual organs, so that the workers themselves are cast merely at its conscious linkages. In the machine, and even more in machinery as an automatic system, the use value, such as the material quality of the means of labor, is transformed into an existence adequate to fixed capital, and the capital as such, in the form in which it was adopted into the production process of capital. The direct means of labor is superseded by a form posited by capital itself and corresponding to it. In no way does the machine appear as the individual worker's means of labor. Its distinguishing characteristic is not in the least, as with the means of labor, to transmit the worker's activity to the object. This activity, rather, is posited in such a way that it merely transmits the machine's work. The machine's action onto the raw material supervises it and guards against interruptions. Not as with the instrument, if the worker animates and makes into his own organ, with his skill and strength, and whose handling therefore depends on his virtuosity. Rather, it is the machine which possesses skill and strength in place of the worker. It is itself the virtuoso with a soul of its own, and the mechanical laws acting through it, and it consumes coal, oil, etc. Just as the worker consumes food to keep up in its perpetual motion, the worker's activity, reduced to a mere abstraction of activity, is determined and regulated on all sides by the movement of the machinery, and not the opposite. The science which compels the inanimate limbs of machinery by their construction to act purposefully as an automaton does not exist in the worker's consciousness, but rather acts upon him through the machine as an alien power, as the power of the machine itself. The appropriation of living labor by objectified labor, of the power or activity which creates value by value existing for itself, which lies in the concept of capital, is posited, and production resting on machinery, as the capital of the production process itself, including its material elements and its material motion. The production process has ceased to be a labor process in the sense of a process dominated by labor as its governing unity. Labor appears rather merely as a conscious organ scattered among the individual living workers at numerous points of the mechanical system, subsumed under the total process of the machinery itself, as itself only a link of the system whose unity exists not in the living worker, but rather in the living active machinery, which confronts his individual insignificant doings as a mighty organism. In machinery, objectified labor confronts living labor within the labor process itself as the power which rules it. A power which was, as the appropriation of living labor, is the form of capital. The transformation of the means of labor into machinery, and of living labor into a mere living accessory of this machinery as the means of its action, also posits the absorption of the labor process in its material character as a mere moment of the realization process of capital. The increase of the productive forces of labor in the greatest possible negation of necessary labor is the necessary tendency of capital, as we have seen. The transformation of the means of labor into machinery is a realization of this tendency. In machinery, objectified labor materially confronts living labor as a ruling power and as an active subsumption of the latter under itself, not only by appropriating it, but in real production process itself. The relation of capital as value, which appropriates value-creating activity, is, in fixed capital, existing as machinery, posit at the same time as a relation of the use value of capital to the machinery. To the use value of labor capacity. Further, the value objectified in machinery appears as a presupposition against which the value-creating power of the individual labor capacity is infinitesimal, vanishing magnitude. The production, in enormous mass quantities, which is posited with machinery, destroys every connection of the product with the direct need of the producer, and hence with the direct use value. It is already posited in the form of the product's production, and in relation to which it is produced, that it is produced only as a conveyor of value, and its use value only as a condition to that end. In machinery, objectified labor itself appears not only in the form of product or of the product employed as means of labor, but in the form of the force of production itself. The development of the means in the form of the force of production means of labor into machinery is not an accidental moment of capital, but is rather the historically reshaping of the traditional inherited means of labor into a general form adequate to capital. The accumulation of knowledge and of skill to the general productive force of the social brain is thus absorbed into capital, as opposed to labor, and hence appears as an attribute of capital, and is more specifically a fixed capital, and so as far as it enters into the production process as a means of production proper. Machinery appears, then, as the most adequate form of fixed capital, and fixed capital, insofar as capital's relations with itself are concerned, appearance as the most adequate form of capital as such. In another respect, however, insofar as fixed capital is condemned to an existence within the confines of a specific use value, it does not correspond to the concept of capital, which, as value, is indifferent to every specific form or use value, and can adopt or shed any of them as equivalent incarnations. In this respect, as regards capital's external relations, is not circulating capital, which appears as the adequate form of capital, and not fixed capital. It is circulating capital, which appears. Further, insofar as machinery develops with the accumulation of society's science of productivity force generally, general social labor persists itself not in labor but in capital. The productive force of society is measured in fixed capital, exists there in the objective form, and inversely, the force of capital grows with this general progress, which capital appropriates free of charge. This is not the place to go into the development of machinery in detail, rather only in its general aspect, insofar as the means of labor, as a physical thing, loses its direct form, becomes fixed capital, it confronts the worker physically as capital. In machinery, knowledge appears as alien, external to him, and living labor as subsumed under the self-activating objectified labor. The worker appears as superfluous to the extent that his action is not determined by capital's requirements. The full development of capital, therefore, takes place, or capital has posited the mode of production corresponding to it, only when the means of labor has not only taken the economic form of fixed capital, but is also suspended in its immediate form, and when fixed capital appears as a machine within the production process opposite labor, and the entire production process appears as not subsumed under the direct skillfulness of the worker, but rather as a technological application of science. It is hence the tendency of capital to give production a scientific character. Direct labor is reduced to a mere moment of this process. As with the transformation of value into capital, so does it appear in the further development of labor. In the further development of capital, that it presupposes a certain given historical development of the productive forces on one side. Science, too, is among these productive forces. On the other, drives and forces them further onwards. Thus, the quantitative extent and the effectiveness intensity to which capital is developed as fixed capital indicates the general degree to which capital is developed as capital, as power over living labor, into which it has conquered the production process as such. Also, in the sense that it expresses the accumulation of objectified productive forces and likewise of objectified labor. However, while capital gives itself its adequate form a use value, within which the production process only in the form of machinery and of the material manifestations of fixed capital, such as railways, to which we shall return later, there is in no way means that this use value, machinery as such, is capital, or that its existence as machinery is identical with its existence as capital, any more than gold would cease to have use value as gold if it were no longer money. Machinery does not lose its use value as soon as it ceases to be capital. While machinery is the most appropriate form of the use value of fixed capital, it does not at all follow that therefore subsumption under social relations of capital is the most appropriate and ultimate social relation of production for the application of machinery. That's a very important line because a lot of people get that confused. To the degree that labor time, the mere quantity of labor, is posited by capital, as to the sole determinant element. To the degree does direct labor and its quantity disappear as a determinate production of principle of production, or the creation of use values, and is reduced both quantitatively to a smaller proportion and qualitatively as an, of course, indispensable but subordinate moment compared to the general scientific labor technology appears of natural sciences on one side, and the general productive forces arising from social combination in total production on the other side. A combination which appears as a natural fruit of social labor, although it is a historical product. Capital thus works towards its own dissolution as the form of dominating production. Fixed capital and circulating capital as two particular kinds of capital. While up to now, fixed capital and circulating capital appeared merely as different passing aspects of capital, they have now hardened into two particular modes of its existence. And fixed capital appears separately alongside circulating capital. They are now two particular kinds of capital. Insofar as a capital is examined in the particular branch of production, it appears as divided into these two portions, or splits into these two kinds of capital in certain proportions. The division within the production process, originally between means of labor and means of material of labor, and finally products of labor, now appear as circulating capital, the last two, and fixed capital, the first. The split within capital, as regards its merely physical aspect, has now entered into its form itself and appears as differentiating it. From a viewpoint such as Lauderdale's, who would like to have capital as such separately from labor, creating value and hence also surplus value or profit, fixed capital, namely that whose physical presence or use value is machinery, is the form which gives their superficial fallacies still the greatest semblance of validity. The answer to them, in Labor Defended, is that the road builder may share profits with the road user, but the road itself cannot do so. Circulating capital presupposes that it really passes through its different phases, brings about the decrease or increase, the brevity or length of circulation time, the easier or more troublesome completion of the different stages of circulation, a decrease of the surplus value which could be created in a given period of time without these interruptions, either because the number of reproductions grows smaller, or because the quantity of capital continuously engaged in the production process is reduced. In both cases, this is not a reduction of the initial value, but rather a reduction of the rate of growth. From the moment, however, when fixed capital has developed to a certain extent, and this extent, as we indicate, is the measure of the development of large industry generally, hence fixed capital increases in proportion to the development of large industry's productive forces. It is itself the objectification of these productive forces as presupposed product. From this instant on, every interruption on the production process acts as different reproduction of capital itself of its initial value. The value of fixed capital is reproduced only insofar as it is used up in the production process. Through disuse, it loses its use value without its value passing on to the product. Hence, the greater the scale on which fixed capital develops, in the sense in which we regard it here, the more does it continue the continuity of the production process or the constant flow of reproduction become an externally compelling condition for the mode of production founded on capital. In machinery, the appropriation of living labor by capital achieves a direct reality in this respect as well. This firstly, the analysis and application of mechanical and chemical laws arising directly out of science, which enables the machinery to perform the same labor as the previously performed by the workers. However, the development of machinery along this path occurs only when large industry has already reached a higher stage and all the sciences have been pressed into the service of capital, and when secondly, the available machinery itself already provides great capabilities. Invention then becomes a business, and the application of science to direct production itself becomes a prospect which determines and solicits it. But this is not road along with machinery. But this is not the road along which machinery, by and large, arose, and even less the road on which it progresses in detail. This road is rather dissected through the division of labor, which gradually transforms the workers' operations into more and more mechanical ones, so that a certain point of mechanism can step into place. See the economy under power. See under economy of power. Thus, the specific mode of working here appears directly as becoming transferred from the worker to capital in the form of the machine, and his own labor capacities devalued thereby. Hence, the worker's struggle against machinery, what was the living worker's activity, becomes the activity of the machine. Thus, the appropriation of labor by capital confronts the workers in a coarsely sensuous form. Capital absorbs labor into itself as though its body were by love possessed. Contradiction between the foundation of bourgeois production and its development. The exchange of living labor for objectified labor, such as the pausing of social labor in the form of the contradiction of capital and wage labor, is the ultimate development of the value relation and of production resting on value. Its presupposition is and remains the mass of direct labor time, the quantity of labor employed, as the determinant factor in the production of wealth, but to the degree that large industry develops, the creation of real wealth comes to depend less on labor time and on the amount of labor employed than on the power of the agencies set in motion during the labor time, whose powerful effectiveness is itself in turn out of all the proportion to the direct labor time spent on their production, but depends rather on the general state of science and on the progress of technology or the application of the science to production. The development of the science, especially natural science, and all others with the latter is itself in turn related to the development of material production. Agriculture becomes merely the application of science of material metabolism, its regulation for the greatest advantage of the entire body of society. Real wealth manifests itself rather in large industry, reveals itself this in the monstrous disproportion between the labor time applied and its product, as well as in the qualitative imbalance between labor reduced to a pure abstraction and the power of the production process it superintends. Labor no longer appears so much as to be included within the production process. Rather, the human being comes to relate more as watchman and regulator of the production process itself. What holds for machinery holds likewise for the combination of human activities and the development of human intercourse. No longer does the worker insert a modified natural thing as middle link between the object and himself. Rather, he inserts the process of nature, transformed into an industrial process, as a means between himself and organic nature, mastering it. He steps to the side of the production process instead of being its chief actor. In this transformation, it is neither the direct human labor himself performed, nor the time during which he works, but rather the appropriation of his own general productive power. His understanding of nature and his mastery over it by virtue of his presence as social body, it is, in a word, the development of the social underneath which appears as the great foundation stone of production and of wealth. The theft of alien labor time, on which the present wealth is based, appears as miserable foundation in face of this new one, created by large-scale industry itself. As soon as labor, in the direct form, has ceased to be the great wellspring of wealth, labor time ceases and must cease to be its measure, and hence exchange value must cease to be the measure of use value. The surplus labor of the mass has ceased to be the condition for the development of general wealth, just as the non-labor of the few for the development of the general powers of human head. With that, production based on exchange value breaks down and the direct material production process is stripped of the form of penury and antithesis. The free development of individualities, and hence not the reduction of necessary labor time so as to deposit surplus labor, but rather the general reduction of the necessary labor as society to a minimum, which then corresponds to the artistic, scientific, etc. development of the individual, is the time set free and with the means created for all of them. Capital itself is the moving contradiction in that it presses to reduce labor time to a minimum, while it posits labor time on the other side as sole measure and source of wealth. Hence, it diminishes labor time in the necessary form so as to increase it in the superfluous form. Hence posits the superfluous and growing measure as a condition, question of life or death for the necessary on the one side, then it calls to life all the powers of science and of nature, as of social combination and of social intercourse, in order to make the creation of wealth independent relatively of the labor time employed on it. On the other side, it wants to use labor time as the measuring rod for the giant social forces thereby created and to confine them within the limit required to maintain the already created value as value. Forces of production and social relations, two different sides of the development of the social individual, appears to capital as mere means and merely means for the product on its limited foundation. In fact, however, they are the material condition to blow this foundation sky high. That's another phrase I would have expected to read in the book from the 1800s. Truly wealthy a nation when the working day is 6 rather than 12 hours. Wealth is not command over surplus labor time, real wealth, but rather disposable time outside that needed in direct production of every individual and the whole society. Nature builds no machine, nor locomotives, railways, electric-type telegraphs, self-acting mules, etc. These are products of human industry, natural material transformed into organic organs of the human will over nature, or the human participation in nature. They are organs of the human brain, created by the human hand. The power of knowledge objectified. The development of fixed capital indicates to what degree general social knowledge has become a direct force of production, and to what degree, hence, the conditions of the process of social life itself have come under the control of the general intellect and have been transformed in accordance with it. To what degree the powers of social production have been produced, not only in the form of knowledge, but also as immediate organs of social practice of real-life process. Significance of the development of fixed capital. The development of fixed capital indicates, in still another respect, the degree of development of wealth generally, or of capital. The aim of production oriented directly towards use value, as well as that directly oriented towards exchange value, is the product itself, destined for consumption. The part of production which is oriented towards the production of fixed capital does not produce direct objects of individual gratification, nor direct exchange values, at least not directly realizable exchange values. Hence, only when a certain degree of productivity has already been reached, so that a part of production time is sufficient for immediate production, can an increasingly large part be applied to the production of the means of production. This requires that society be able to wait the large part of the wealth already created can be withdrawn both from immediate consumption and from production for immediate consumption in order to employ this part of labor, which is not immediately productive, within the material production process itself. This requires a certain level of productivity and of relative overabundance, and more specifically, a level directly related to the transformation of circulating capital into fixed capital. As the magnitude of relative surplus labor depends on the productivity of necessary labor, so does the magnitude of labor time, living as well as objectified, employed on the production of fixed capital depends on the productivity of the labor time spent in the direct production of products. Surplus population, from this standpoint, as well as surplus production, is a condition for this. That is, the direct output of the time employed in a direct production must be larger, relatively, than is directly required for the reproduction of the capital employed in these branches of industry. The smaller the direct fruits borne by fixed capital, the less it intervenes in the direct production process. The greater must be this relative surplus population and surplus production, thus more to build railways, canals, aqueducts, telegraphs, than to build a machinery directly active in the direct production process. hence a subject to which we return later in the constant under- and overproduction of modern industry, constant fluctuations and convulsions arising from the disproportion where sometimes too little, then too much circulating capital is transformed into fixed capital. Oh yeah, that's his sector A to B thing that you might hear about. That's what that's about. The creation of large quantity of disposable time, apart from necessary labor time for society generally, and each of its members, like room for development of the individual's full productive forces, hence does society also. This creation of not labor time appears in the stage of capital, as all earlier ones, as not labor time, free time for a few. What capital adds is that it increases the surplus labor time of the mass by all means of art and science, because its wealth consists directly in the appropriation of surplus labor time. Since value directly its purpose, not use value. It is thus, despite itself, instrumental in creating the means of society, means of social disposable time, in order to reduce labor time for the whole society to a diminishing minimum, and thus to free everyone's time for their own development, but its tendency always on the one side to create disposable time on the other to divert it into surplus labor. If it succeeds too well at first, then it suffers from surplus production, and then necessary labor is interrupted, but no surplus labor can be realized by capital. The more this contradiction develops, the more does it become evident that the growth of the forces of production can no longer be bound up with the appropriation of alien labor, but that the mass of workers must themselves appropriate their own surplus labor. Once they have done so, and disposable time thereby ceases to have an antithetical existence, then on one side, necessary labor time will be measured by the needs of the social individual, and on the other, the development of the power of social production will grow so rapidly that even though the production is now calculated for wealth of all, disposable time will grow for all. This is important to note. Let me highlight this. That's important. For real wealth is the developed productive power of all individuals. The measure of wealth is then not any longer in any way labor time, but rather disposable time. Labor time, as a measure of value, posits wealth itself as founded on poverty, and disposable time as existing in and because of the antithesis to surplus labor time, or the pausing of an individual's entire time as labor time, and its degradation, therefore the mere worker's subsumption under labor. The most developed machinery thus forces the worker to work longer than the savage does, or than he himself did with the simplest, crudest tools. This is very important. We need to talk to postmodernists who think like worker is like an identity or something, and therefore like fighting for reduction, like workers' rights or something, is like reformist or whatever. This is important for that. It's like, no, workers don't do this because they've been ideologically blinded by the fact that they're workers. They're doing this because this directly affects their material life. Anyways, if the entire labor of a country were sufficient only to raise the support of the whole population, then there would be no surplus labor. Consequently, nothing that would be allowed to accumulate as capital. If in 1 year the people raise enough for the support of 2 years, one's labor consumption must perish, or for 1 year, men must cease from productive labor, but the possessor of the surplus product of capital employ people upon something not directly and immediately productive, and the erection of the machinery, so it goes on. As the basis on which large industry rests, the appropriation of alien labor time ceases with its development to make up or create wealth, so does direct labor, as such cease to be the basis of production, since in one respect it is transformed more into a supervisory and regulatory activity, but then also because the product ceases to be the product of isolated direct labor, and the combination of the social activity appears, rather, as a producer. As soon as the division of labor is developed, almost every piece of work done by a single individual is part of a whole. Having no value or utility of itself, there is nothing on which the laborer can seize. This is my produce, and this I will keep. In direct exchange, individual direct labor appears as realized in a particular product, or part of the product, its communal social character. Its character as product, or its character as objectification of general labor and satisfaction of the general need is posited through exchange alone. In the production process of large-scale industry, by contrast, just as the conquest of the forces of nature by the social intellect is the precondition of the productive power of the means of labor as they developed into the automatic process on the one side, so on the other is the labor of the individual in its direct presence posited as suspended individual, such as social labor. Thus, the other basis of this mode of production falls away. The labor time employed in this production of fixed capital relates to that employed in the production of circulating capital within the production process of capital itself, as the surplus labor time to necessary labor time, to the degree that the production aimed at the satisfaction of immediate need becomes more productive. A greater part of the production can be directed towards the needs of production itself, or the production of means of production. Insofar as the production of fixed capital, even in its physical aspect, is directed immediately not towards the production of direct use value, or towards the production of values required for the direct reproduction of capital, such as those which themselves in turn represent use value in the value creation process, but rather towards the production of the means of value creation. That is not towards value as an immediate object, but rather towards value creation, towards the means of realization as an immediate object of production, and the production of value posited the physically in the object of production itself as the aim of production. The rectification of productive forces, the value-producing powers of capital, to that extent, is in the production of fixed capital, that capital posits itself as an end in itself and appears active as capital to a higher power than does in the production of circulating capital. That was all one sentence, by the way. What? That was all one sentence. Hence, in this regard, as well, the diminution already possessed by fixed capital, which its production occupies within total production, is the measuring rod of the development of wealth founded on the mode of production of capital. The number of workers depends on as much as circulating capital as it depends on the quantity of products of coexisting labor which laborers are allowed to consume. In all the excerpts cited above from various economists, fixed capital is regarded as part of capital, which is locked into the various process. Floating capital is consumed. Fixed capital is merely used in the great process of production. This wrong and holds only for part of the circulating capital, which is itself consumed by the fixed capital, the matières instrumentales, the only thing consumed in the great process of production. If this means the immediate production process is fixed capital, consumption within the production process is, however, in fact, use wearing out. Furthermore, the greater durability of fixed capital must not be conceived as a purely physical quality. The iron in the wood which make up the bed I sleep in, or the stones make up the house I live in, or the marble statue which decorates a palace are just as durable as iron and wood used for machinery, but durability is a condition for the instrument, the means of production, not only on the technical ground that metals are the chief material of all machinery, but rather because the instrument is destined to play the same role constantly in a repeated process of production. Its durability as means of production is a required quality of its use value. The more often it must be replaced, the costlier it is. The larger the part of capital, which would have to be spent on it uselessly. Its durability is its existence as a means of production. Its duration is an increase of its productive force. With circulating capital, by contrast, insofar as it is not transformed into fixed capital, durability is in no way connected with the act of production itself, and is therefore not a conceptually posited moment. The fact that among the articles thrown into the consumption fund, there are some which are in turn characterized as fixed capital because they are consumed solely and can be consumed by many individuals in a series, is connected with the further determination, renting rather than buying, interest, etc., with which we are not yet here concerned. Since the general introduction of solus mechanism and British manufactures, people have, with rare exception, been treated as a secondary and subordinate machine, so far more attention has been given to the perfection of the raw materials of woods and metals than those of human body and spirit. Real savings economy, true conception of the process of social production. Real economy savings consist of the savings of labor time, minimum and minimization of production costs, but this savings identical with the development of the productive force. Hence, in no way abstinence from consumption, but rather the development of power, of capabilities of reproduction, and hence both of the capabilities as well as the means of consumption. The capability to consume is a condition of consumption, hence its primary means in this capability is the development of an individual potential, a force of production. The savings of labor time is equal to an increasing of free time, such as the time for the full development of the individual, which in turn reacts back upon the productive power of labor as itself, the greatest productive power. From the standpoint of this direct production process, it can be regarded as the production of fixed capital. This fixed capital being man himself. It goes without saying, by the way, that direct labor time itself cannot remain in the abstract antithesis to free time in which it appears from the perspective of bourgeois economy. Labor cannot become play, as Fourier would like, although it remains his greatest contribution to have expressed the suspension not of distribution, but of the modes of production itself in a higher form as the ultimate object. Labor cannot be play, was a good line from Marx. Free time, which is both idle and time for higher activity, has naturally transformed its possessor into a different subject, and then he enters into the direct production process as this different subject. This process is in both discipline as regards the human activity being in the process of becoming, and at the same time practice, experimental science, material creative and objectifying science as regards to the human who has become, in whose head exists the accumulated knowledge of society. For both, insofar as labor requires practical use of the hands and free bodily movement as in agriculture, at the same time exercise. As the system of bourgeois economy has developed for us only by degrees, so too its negation, which is its ultimate result. We are still concerned now with the direct production process. When we consider bourgeois society in the long view, and as a whole, then the final result of the process of social production always appears as the society itself, such as the human being itself in its social relation. Everything that has a fixed form, such as the product, appears as merely a moment of vanishing moment in this movement. The direct production process itself here appears as only a moment. The condition and the objectifications of this process are themselves equally moments of it, and its only subject are the individuals, but the individuals in mutual relationship, which they equally reproduce and produce anew. The constant process of their own movement, in which they renew themselves even as they renew the world of wealth they create. The end of capitalism. Beyond a certain point, the development of the powers of production become a barrier for capital. Hence the capital relation, a barrier for the development of the productive power of labor. When it has reached this point, capital, i.e. wage labor, enters into the same relation towards the development of social wealth and of the forces of production as the guild system, serfdom, slavery, and is necessarily stripped of its fetters. The last form of the servitude assumed by human activity, that of wage labor on the one side, capital on the other, is thereby cast off like a skin. And this casting off itself is the result of the mode of production corresponding to capital. The material and mental conditions of this negation of wage labor and of capital themselves, already the negation of earlier forms of unfree social production, are themselves results in its production process. This growing incompatibility between the productive development of society and its hitherto existing relations of developed production expresses itself in bitter contradictions, cries, spasms. The violent destruction of capital, not by relations external to it, but rather as a condition of its self-preservation, is the most striking form in which advice is given to be gone and to give room to a higher state of social production. It is not only the growth of scientific power, but the measure in which it is already posited at fixed capital, the scope and width in which it is realized and has conquered the totality of production. It is likewise the development of the population, in short, of all movements of production, in that the productive power of labor, like the application of machinery, is related to the population, whose growth in and for itself already the presupposition as well as the result of the growth of the use value to be reproduced, and hence also be consumed. Since this decline of profit signifies the same as the decrease of immediate labor relative to the size of the objectified labor which it pre-produces and newly posits capital, will attempt every means of checking the smallness of the relation of living labor to the size of the capital generally, hence also a surplus value is expressed as profit relative to the presupposed capital by reducing the allotment made to necessary labor, and by still more expanding the quantity of surplus labor with regard to the whole labor employed. Hence, the highest development of productive power, together with the greatest expansion of existing wealth, will coincide with depreciation of capital, degradation of the labor, and a most straitened exhaustion of its vital powers. These contradictions lead to explosions, cataclysms, crises, in which by momentary suspension of labor and annihilation of a great portion of capital, the latter is violently reduced to a point in which it can go on. These contradictions, of course, lead to explosions, crises in which momentary suspension of labor and annihilation of a great part of capital violently leads it back to the point where it is enabled to go on, fully employing its productive powers without committing suicide. Yet these regular recurrent catastrophes lead to a repetition on a higher scale, and it's finally to its violent overthrow. That's a very important line that is oft overlooked. Capitalism, Alienation, and Communism. The fact that in the development of the productive powers of labor, the objective conditions of labor, objectified labor, must grow relative to living labor. This is actually a tautological statement, for what else does growing productive power of labor mean than the less immediate labor is required to create a greater product, and therefore social wealth exists itself more and more in the condition of labor created by labor itself. The fact appears from the standpoint of capital not in such a way that one of the moments of social movement activity, objective labor, becomes the ever more powerful body of the other moment of subjective living labor, but rather, and this is important for wage labor, that the objective conditions of labor, assuming an ever more colossal independence, represented by its very extent, opposite living labor in the social wealth, confronts labor in more powerful portion as an alien and dominant power. The emphasis comes to be placed not on the state of being objectified, but on the state of being alienated, dispossessed, sold. On the condition that the monstrous objective power, which social labor itself erected, that the monstrous object erected opposite itself as one of its moments belongs not to the worker, but to the personified conditions of production, to capital, to the extent that, from the standpoint of capital and wage labor, the creation of the objective body of actuality happens in antithesis to the immediate labor capacity, that this process of objectification in fact appears as a process of dispossession from the standpoint of labor, as an appropriation of alien labor from the standpoint of capital, to the extent this twisting and inversion is a real phenomenon, not merely supposed to be one existing merely in the imagination of the worker and the capitalist, but obviously this process of inversion is a merely historical necessity, a necessity for the development of the forces of production solely from the specific historical point of departure or basis, but in no way an absolute necessity of production, rather a vanishing one, and the result of the inherent purposes of this process is to suspend this basis itself together with this form of process. The bourgeois economists are so much cooped up within the notions belonging to a specific historical stage of social development that the necessity of the objectification of the powers of social labor appeared to them as inseparable from the necessity of their alienation vis-a-vis living labor. But with the suspension of the necessity of this alienation, suspension of the immediate character of living labor as merely individual, or as general, merely internally as merely external, with the pausing of the activity of individuals as immediate general or social activity, the objective movement of the production are stripped of this form of alienation. They are thereby posited as property, as the organic social body within which the individuals reproduce themselves as individuals, but as social individual. The conditions which allows them to exist in this way in reproduction of their life, in the productive life's process, have been posited only by the historical economic process itself, both the objective and the subjective conditions, which are the only two distinct forms of the same conditions. The worker's propertylessness and the ownership of living labor by objectified labor, or the appropriation of alien labor by capital, both merely expresses the same relation from the opposite pole, are fundamental conditions of the bourgeois mode of production, in no way accidents irrelevant to it. These modes of distribution are the relations of production themselves, but subspecies distributionist. It is therefore highly absurd to say when Mill says principles of political economy, the laws and conditions of the production of wealth partake of the character of physical truths. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense. It is not with the distribution of wealth that is a matter of human institutions solely. The law and conditions of the production of wealth and the law of the distribution of wealth are the same laws under the differential forms, and both change undergo the same historical process, or as such only a moment of a historical process. It requires no greater penetration that to grasp that where free labor or wage labor arising out of the dissolution of bondage is a point of departure. Their machines can only arise in antithesis of living labor as property alien to it and as power hostile to it, that they must confront it as capital. But as just as easily perceived, the machines will not cease to be agencies of social production when they become property of the associated workers. In the first case, however, their distribution, that they do not belong to the worker, is just as much a condition of the mode of production founded on wage labor. In the second case, the changed distribution would start from a changed foundation of production, a new foundation first created by the process of history. Alright, and to finish off here, so technology develops a general intellect, that is to say, socially accumulated science and automation, which makes measuring wealth by hours worked obsolete. This is kind of high-level stuff. I don't know if this is necessarily his final viewpoint by the time he gets to Capital. There's a paper on this by Heinrich and you read. I do not like Heinrich, but maybe he's right on this. Machines only transfer their existing value or realize the collective history of human science, objectified labor. They do not magically generate new surplus labor, independent of the human social grid that builds and maintains these machines. The road builder may share profits with the road user, but the road itself cannot be the one doing so. Capitalism is fundamentally unstable because it relies on exploiting workers' time to make a profit, yet competition forces capitalists to buy machines that eliminate workers. By reducing necessary labor to a minimum, capitalism creates its core contradiction. The true goal of communism is the general reduction of the necessary labor of society to a minimum, which then corresponds to the artist, scientific, etc. development of the individual in his time set free and the means created for all of them. Labor cannot become play. You know, that's kind of just a silly anarchist thing. We need to reorganize labor is play. Okay, it will cease to be the exhausting drudgery, but workers will have ample free time to learn and grow and to re-enter production as highly educated scientific coordinators. Work will become an exercise of human mastery in experimental science, not penal attitude. Like anarchists who say we need to reorganize work as play. You're not work abolitionists. You just want to make gamified. You just want to make work like, I don't know, you get points or something. Like, that's all that would be. That would just turn work into a game. Like, I mean, you could do that, but like that has nothing to do with abolishing work. That's kind of just like that's like the dream of like, that's just like, I don't know, the Nordic model kind of. So in crisis, recessions, and the literal destruction of capital are built-in self-preservation mechanisms for capitalism. These catastrophic cycles will only repeat on a grander scale until the system is entirely overblown. The hostility of machines towards workers is a historical artifact of wage labor, not an intrinsic property of the machine. Once tools and infrastructure become the collective property of the associated worker, they're stripped of their alien power and become the organic social body through which humanity thrives. Anyways, that's that's it for the Grundrisse excerpts. These are all the excerpts from the Marx-Engels reader. As far as I'm aware, these are the most important ones, but I mean, feel free to comment any specific chapters that are not covered in this. But yeah, this is definitely good because there's no English audiobook for the Grundrisse. I've kind of thought about it, but I don't know if the whole Grundrisse is necessarily worth reading if you've already read all this other stuff. Maybe just, I might check out one of the secondaries or whatever on it and see if I get more interest, but I think this is enough for like most people.